Hey guys, tonight we're going to sink into the soft hay-scented dream of a sleepy little French village, sometime around the 14th century, where the laws are confusing, the weather is damp, and yes, a goose is about to stand trial in a proper courtroom. You're in the audience. You're blinking slowly. And you're probably wondering what kind of world would bother putting a bird on trial. The stone walls around you are cold, but the air is thick with the warm musk of damp cloaks, muddy boots, and barnyard anxiety. You can hear the scraping of wooden benches, the murmurs of confused peasants, and somewhere in the background, an indignant honk. Yes, that's your defendant. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere cozy right now, tell me your location and what time it is. I love seeing the sleepy map we create together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the village of Autun, tucked deep in the folds of medieval Burgundy. It's not an important place, not the sort of village that will ever appear on royal maps or pilgrimage routes. But today, it's famous for trying a goose. Not eating it, not roasting it. Trying it. In court. Like it's a particularly suspicious duke with feathers. You shift a little on your uneven bench. Outside, the bell tower tolls one heavy note, a signal that the proceedings are about to begin. The townsfolk shuffle in, squinting through the gloom. The judge arrives, looking like he's deeply regretting every career choice that led to presiding over poultry litigation. Before you, in a makeshift wooden dock, stands the goose. It looks exactly how you'd expect, slightly muddy, entirely uninterested, and chewing vaguely on something it definitely found on the courthouse floor. There's a tiny collar around its neck, like that might help maintain courtroom decorum. It does not. This is no joke for the villagers, though. The accused goose is believed to have committed a crime. Specifically, it was said to have destroyed sacred crops, disturbed a harvest procession, and, depending on who you ask, either desecrated a local altar or pooped aggressively near one. You can't quite get a straight story. But the collective agreement is that something needs to be done. The legal machinery clanks into gear, slowly, creakily, and with more parchment than you thought was possible for a case involving feathers. In medieval Europe, it wasn't uncommon to hold animal trials. Pigs, for instance, were frequently executed for eating babies. Yes, that's a thing. And goats, cows, and even insects were dragged before courts for offenses ranging from theft to blasphemy. But this goose? This one's special. You peer around the courtroom and wonder who even filed the complaint. Historians still argue whether this was a form of moral panic, religious performance art, or just the town needing a scapegoat. Yes, pun fully intended. The answer probably lives somewhere in the messy middle, where legal theory and local superstition awkwardly hug. From the back row, someone coughs. A child giggles, then stops abruptly when their mother hisses. The judge adjusts his hat, takes a deep breath, and begins the official reading of the charges. It's a spectacle. His words are lofty, ceremonial, completely over the top for a case that involves a creature that can't understand grammar. Still, the charges are clear enough: crop destruction, disruption of a holy rite, and public nuisance. The goose continues to chew on its mystery object. You, meanwhile, are fighting off a yawn. It's not that the event isn't entertaining, far from it. It's more that everything is moving at the exact glacial pace of medieval bureaucracy. And it's incredibly soothing, in a strange way. Like watching a heavily inked, robe-wearing man read legal Latin to a barnyard animal while villagers nod solemnly. Eventually, the prosecutor takes his position. He's a stout man with a high forehead and a sense of importance that could inflate a windmill. He accuses the goose with all the gravitas of a man who has just discovered corruption in the court of Louis IX. His voice echoes through the courtroom as he describes the goose's wanton disregard for communal harmony. You can't tell if he's being serious or is just thrilled to finally use the word wanton in public. Then the defense steps forward. A poor clerk with shoes held together by hope and mud. He's been appointed to represent the goose, presumably because someone lost a bet. His argument is simple: the goose is incapable of intentional crime because it's a goose. Also, there are no eyewitnesses. And anyway, isn't the real crime the overproduction of turnips this season? The judge nods, scribbles something, and calls for witnesses. You glance back at the goose. It seems to be asleep now. Or meditating. Hard to tell. Either way, it's probably having a better time than you did at your last dentist appointment. One by one, townspeople stand and share their tales. A farmer insists that the goose ruined his entire harvest with its cursed presence. A washerwoman claims the bird stared directly into her soul during Massachusetts. A shepherd accuses it of knowing too much. You begin to suspect that maybe the goose just happened to waddle by at the wrong time and get blamed for a very bad Tuesday. Still, the seriousness of the event is oddly comforting. These people are committed to their little world, to their rules, to making sense of chaos, even if it means putting a bird on trial. There's a sleepy, honey-thick logic to it all. When the universe feels unpredictable, someone needs to say, that goose is the problem. Let's fix it. A scribe sits off to the side, dutifully recording the proceedings in looping script. Somewhere, that parchment may still exist, stored in a dusty archive under notable livestock incidents. You wonder what else is in that folder. As the sun begins to sink outside, casting long amber bars of light across the courtroom floor, the judge clears his throat. More testimonies are coming. You're not going anywhere yet. The goose lets out one soft, judgmental honk. The judge raises a hand to settle the murmurs, his fingers stiff from both age and the chill creeping in from the drafty stone walls. The courtroom quiets, and you shift a little on your seat again, trying to find a spot in the wood that isn't waging war on your tailbone. Your eyes drift across the gallery, faces flush with anticipation, confusion, or boredom, sometimes all three. This is more than just a trial. It's theater. It's ritual. It's a community event on par with market day or a poorly attended wedding. Everyone is here because, deep down, they believe something important is happening. Or at least, they're hoping something weird might. You lean forward slightly as the next speaker stands, a tall, thin man with twigs in his hair and mud on his robe. A monk, clearly, but the disheveled kind, like he lost a wrestling match with the garden on the way here. He clears his throat and announces that he will speak for the grain. Yes. The grain. You stifle a chuckle. He claims the goose desecrated sacred wheat set aside for the church's harvest feast. You raise an eyebrow, unsure whether the wheat was blessed, or the goose was just incredibly rude. Either way, the man insists that the crops failed that season, and it's definitely the judge nods, scratching his chin thoughtfully, as if pondering the spiritual implications of avian-induced famine. He thanks the monk, who bows low, too low, and topples over sideways into a startled clergyman. The goose honks approvingly. As the proceedings drag on, your mind drifts. What kind of legal system is this? You're not dreaming it. Medieval France really did have a thing for putting animals on trial. There were two legal systems in play, one run by the church, called ecclesiastical courts, and one by secular authorities. The problem? No one could quite agree where a goose landed on the spectrum of divine versus civil disruption. Was it a sinner or a criminal? Theologians, never ones to pass up an argument, had long debated the question of animal souls. Some insisted beasts had none. Others claimed certain animals, usually cats or birds associated with witches, might harbor demonic influences. And a few, possibly just bored monks with too much parchment, believed geese had free will and could be tempted by sin. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed animals were morally responsible, or if these trials were just a complex metaphor. Some say it was all pageantry, designed to reinforce authority by showing that even the lowliest creature was subject to the law. Others argue it was fear-based. The goose became a symbol of whatever invisible chaos people couldn't understand. Famine. Disease. Unexpected hailstorms. You glance at the poor scribe still furiously scribbling away in the corner. His ink-stained fingers look like he's been gently gnawed on by a squid. Still, he carries on, recording every absurdity like it's Roman Senate proceedings. And that's where the weird logic of the age really starts to shine through. This isn't a joke to them. There's an oddly soothing clarity to the way the medieval world handled blame. A bad harvest? Punish the goose. A child's illness? Put a goat on trial. You wonder what they'd have done with your last smartphone meltdown. Probably sentenced a gremlin to exile. At this point, a new figure rises to speak, a noblewoman wrapped in thick wool, her hands gloved in fine leather. She steps forward with an air of authority, ignoring the goose entirely. This bird, she begins dramatically, broke from its flock during the festival of Saint Firmin and marched into the cathedral square, where it disrupted our sacred procession. You can tell this isn't about the goose. This is about pride. Ritual. Maintaining the illusion that, for 1 hour, peasants and nobles alike can march around in matching tabards and not be upstaged by an irritable waterfowl. She continues, breathlessly detailing how the goose flapped wildly during the bishop's blessing, causing 3 altar boys to flee and a banner to catch fire. The cause of the fire is unclear. Possibly candle-related. Possibly divine rage. Possibly the goose stepped on something important. Details are fuzzy. Still, the narrative lands with weight. Even the defense lawyer, still clutching his shredded notes like a man who's realizing he might need a new line of work, lets out a tiny sigh. The crowd murmurs. Somewhere in the back, someone wonders aloud if the goose might be possessed. A whispered prayer begins in a corner. You roll your eyes affectionately. The judge raises his hand again, this time to call for a short recess. To allow for spiritual clarity, he says, though it's probably to stretch his knees and have a sandwich. The townsfolk begin to shuffle out for a brief break. You follow them, stepping into the cold air outside, where the wind smells faintly of hay, horses, and old cheese. As you wander through the muddy streets, you notice a few other animals watching the proceedings from a distance. A goat peers suspiciously around a cart. A pig, tied to a post, snorts derisively. You find a quiet spot near the town well, lean against the stones, and take a long breath. The sky is gray, heavy with the promise of rain, and somewhere a bell chimes softly. In the stillness, the absurdity of the situation fades and a strange kind of logic settles in. This trial isn't really about guilt or innocence. It's about control. In a world ruled by superstition, storms, and stomachs that were rarely full, people needed to believe that justice could exist, even if it meant inventing it. And sometimes, that meant pretending a goose could commit a crime. You head back inside just as the court reconvenes. The atmosphere is heavier now. The novelty is fading. The goose, however, seems recharged, fluffing its feathers dramatically and honking at regular intervals like a defendant desperate for contempt charges. You settle back into your seat, ready for the next phase, the theological bickering. Because if you thought peasants had opinions, wait until you hear what happens when bishops get involved. The judge taps a carved wooden staff against the stone floor, a gesture that carries just enough authority to hush the murmurs and coax everyone back into their seats. The goose remains in the dock, preening smugly, as though it senses that its honks have become the soundtrack to an increasingly unhinged courtroom drama. You nestle back into your spot, noticing how the air has shifted. The room feels tenser now. The villagers are no longer here just for entertainment. They've settled into the rhythm of the trial, and now comes the strange, swirling vortex of church politics. The judge clears his throat and declares, it is time for ecclesiastical consideration. Which is medieval code for, the clergy are about to argue over divine jurisdiction, and it's going to take a while. Enter the bishop. He arrives late, as bishops are wont to do. A cloud of incense and impatience trails him. His robes are elaborate, his hat is tall, and his expression says, I am here under protest. He does not look thrilled to be mediating between a goose and divine wrath. Trailing behind him are 2 junior clerics, both scribbling notes, furiously and occasionally nodding as if they understand Latin faster than the rest of us. They settle beside the bishop as he takes the floor, raising one solemn, ring-heavy hand. The soul of the beast is under God's dominion, he intones. Therefore, judgment must begin with the church. You barely suppress a sigh. Here we go. One of the local abbots immediately rises to challenge that notion. He's got a voice like gravel in soup and a personal vendetta against bishops dating back to some forgotten Lent incident. He points out that while the church may guide humans, animals are part of the temporal world, and that makes them the secular court's problem. A quiet but firm honk punctuates the silence after his speech. Even the goose is over this. The judge puts his face in his hands. You watch the clerics go back and forth, quoting scripture, referencing obscure church councils, and possibly making things up. At one point, the phrase "Did St. Jerome not warn us about the unruly nature of cranes?" is uttered with genuine passion. You have no idea if that's true, and honestly, neither do they. Historians still argue whether these jurisdictional debates were sincere theological concerns or just turf wars in fancy robes. Either way, the Church often insisted on having a say in trials that even remotely hinted at sin or spiritual disruption. And according to the bishop, this Goose's actions fall into that category. Because, brace yourself, the procession it disrupted wasn't just a casual walk through the square. It was part of a feast day honoring Saint Firmin, protector of harvests and patron of obscure French towns with weather problems. The Goose's interruption, they argue, wasn't just inconvenient. It was an affront to divine celebration. A feathery act of blasphemy. You imagine for a moment a celestial court, somewhere in the heavens, pausing to note this incident on an eternal ledger. One line, Goose, interrupted holy rites. Recommend strongly worded sermon. The bishop suggests that, rather than execution, perhaps the goose should be subjected to penance. Maybe fasting. Maybe a pilgrimage. Maybe this is real, having holy water sprinkled on it while monks chant prayers for forgiveness. You glance at the goose, who now looks genuinely interested in something on the floor. Probably a bug. The townspeople aren't buying it. A miller stands and demands justice. If a man had done what this goose did, he shouts, he'd be in the stocks or worse. Someone else yells, at least a man knows what he's doing. Not always, mutters a tired-looking woman near the back. The judge bangs his staff again, but you can tell his heart's not in it. Even he's losing grip on the courtroom's center of gravity. In the lull that follows, a quiet man with sharp eyes and an accent from 2 villages oversteps forward. He identifies himself as a canon lawyer, a specialist in church law. You instantly know he's here to complicate things. He explains, with great seriousness, that animal trials have precedent in both canon and civil law. He references a pagan Falaise who was dressed in human clothes before being hanged for murder, and a swarm of locusts excommunicated in Provence for destroying a vineyard. His point? The church and the court can work together to deliver a sentence that satisfies both heaven and earth. You admire the diplomatic effort. It's rare to see someone try to forge unity through animal litigation. Still, the bishop sniffs dismissively and leans over to whisper something to his clerics. One of them nods and begins drafting what looks suspiciously like a papal letter, just in case this gets escalated. And that's the beauty of medieval systems. Every minor goose-based disruption has the potential to end in Rome. You feel the story pulling tighter around you now, like a wool blanket someone's tucking in carefully. The courtroom isn't just about the goose anymore. It's about who gets to interpret justice, and how power flows through a town too small for politics but too proud for silence. Meanwhile, the goose is nodding off again, head tucked under one wing. The judge finally announces a temporary compromise. The goose will remain in custody while the church and the court confer over jurisdiction. In the meantime, evidence will continue to be gathered, and the goose shall be observed for signs of remorse. You blink. The villagers murmur. The goose scratches itself and lets out a honk that could either be contrition or indigestion. You rise with the others as court is dismissed for the day. Outside, twilight has settled over the town, casting a dull golden sheen across thatched rooftops and crooked chimneys. Somewhere, a dog barks half-heartedly. A group of children chase each other with sticks. Life continues. And yet you can't stop thinking about the question that's floated just under the surface all day. Does justice have to make sense? Or is it enough that it feels like justice? Back in the inn, over a mug of something vaguely alcoholic and possibly medicinal, You stare at the fire and listen to the townsfolk recap the day's events. Everyone has a different take. Some think the goose is a demon in disguise. Others say it's just unlucky. One old man insists it's a reincarnated lord with unfinished business. He doesn't elaborate. You finish your drink, climb up the creaky stairs to your rented cot, and lie back with a smile. Tomorrow, the goose goes on the defensive. And you'll be there, front row. You awaken with a stiff neck and the unmistakable ache of having slept on a mattress stuffed with something that may once have been straw but now mostly resembles sharp moss and broken dreams. The sun is trying to rise outside, sending streaks of pale gold through your window shutters. It's morning in the village again, and yes, the goose is still on trial. After a quick bite of questionable bread and a long sip of something pretending to be cider, you trudge back to the courthouse. The townsfolk are already gathering, buzzing with anticipation. It's not every day you get to watch a goose fight for its honor. Today is the defense's turn. You settle onto your favorite unforgiving bench just as the defense attorney arrives, looking more composed than yesterday, though still a bit like a man who hasn't slept since Epiphany. He places a thick bundle of scrolls onto the table, and adjusts his belt with a sigh that echoes the collective fatigue of everyone forced to argue morality with barnyard animals. The judge enters, followed closely by the now visibly weary bishop, whose hat has developed a slight tilt, possibly from stress or pigeon-related tragedy. The goose is escorted in, once again tethered to a small wooden stake like a particularly petty prisoner of war. It honks once, low and dignified. The lawyer clears his throat and begins. He starts by appealing to the court's sense of proportion. This goose, he says solemnly, is not capable of understanding ecclesiastical ceremony, property boundaries, or the fragile egos of festival organizers. A ripple of titters runs through the room. The goose fluffs up as though it appreciates the gesture. He continues, arguing that no one can say for certain which goose caused the incident in question. Geese, he reminds everyone, are communal creatures, practically indistinguishable from one another unless you know their beak intimately. A soft gasp escapes from someone in the back row. Intimate beak knowledge is, apparently, a hot topic. To bolster his case, he introduces the concept of mistaken identity, an argument that's far more modern-sounding than you expected. Perhaps, he says, another goose committed this transgression. Perhaps even one from a neighboring parish. The real criminal could be waddling free this very moment. The idea causes a stir. Someone mutters about foreign geese corrupting local flocks. Someone else declares that migratory birds have always been suspicious. The judge scribbles a note, perhaps considering the logistics of conducting a goose lineup. Then the defense brings out his first character witness, a shepherd boy named Eloy, no older than 10, with a face smeared in something sticky and a tunic 2 sizes too large. He climbs onto the stand, swinging his legs as he speaks. He claims to know the goose well. She's a good goose, he says earnestly. Follows me sometimes. Doesn't bite. Once she chased off a rat. You can't help smiling. The image of this child and his feathered bodyguard is somehow more convincing than any legal precedent offered so far. The prosecutor scoffs. That proves nothing. The boy puffs out his chest. She helped me find my lamb when it got lost in the fog. You hear someone near the front whisper, a lamb rescuing goose? As if they've just witnessed a minor miracle. Still, the court needs more than anecdotes. The lawyer moves on to historical precedent, unrolling a scroll and reading aloud a case from 1315 in which a cow accused of trampling a vineyard was acquitted on the basis of insufficient fencing. His point, if humans are responsible for containing their animals, shouldn't the goose's owner be on trial instead? This creates a subtle shift in the room. The villagers glance around. Murmurs rise. Who does own the goose? The truth, it seems, is complicated. Multiple families claim the goose as their own, one because it nested near their shed, another because it eats from their compost, and a third because it has the same eyes as Uncle Guy. That last one is not elaborated on. Nor does anyone want it to be. The judge pauses the trial while a constable is dispatched to investigate ownership. Meanwhile, the defense turns philosophical. He poses the question, can a creature be guilty of crime without intent? He references St. Augustine, because of course he does, and explains that, according to certain church interpretations, only beings with moral reason can be culpable. The goose, he argues, lacks such capacity. Unless, he says slowly, we believe this goose made a conscious choice to disrupt sacred rites and trample crops out of malice or pride. The bishop perks up at the word pride, clearly tempted to say something, but remains seated, perhaps because the goose looks like it might charge again. Historians still debate whether medieval courts genuinely considered moral agency in animals, or if this kind of speech was more about showcasing theological literacy than making an actual case. But here, now, in this village courtroom, the question hangs heavily in the air. Is the goose evil, or just being a goose? The defense lets the silence do the work. Then, dramatically, he calls one final witness. A chicken. Yes, an actual chicken, perched awkwardly on the stand in a little wooden crate. The villagers lean forward, and someone claps. The defense explains that this chicken lived with the goose for several seasons, and although it cannot speak, it has never shown fear or aggression toward its feathered housemate. The prosecutor protests. The judge allows it. The chicken blinks slowly. You have now seen a character witness chicken in a criminal trial. Welcome to medieval France. The bishop mutters something about the dignity of the church, while the scribe frantically draws a diagram labeled Goose Chicken Moral Correlation. You wonder if future historians will stumble across it and make wild claims about poultry cults. As the courtroom descends once again into a low buzz of arguments, gossip, and squawking, the judge calls for another recess. Outside, the sky has turned overcast. There's a nip in the air that smells like snow isn't far off. You walk through the village square, now littered with vendors selling roast chestnuts, boiled wine, and novelty goose carvings. Commerce never misses an opportunity. You pause near a fountain, staring at your reflection rippling in the water. You're starting to feel oddly protective of the goose. Maybe it's because, deep down, you recognize the absurdity of the entire trial, but also its strange sincerity. People here genuinely want justice, even if their methods are unconventional. And in their hearts, they believe the world has order. That even a goose, if left unchecked, can upset the balance. The bell tolls again. Time to return. Next up, the prosecution brings its final witnesses, and the goose's fate inches closer to the edge. The afternoon light filters through narrow arched windows as you step back into the courthouse. It bathes the chamber in soft, dusty amber, the kind of glow that makes even a goose trial feel vaguely sacred. The villagers take their seats with renewed purpose, bellies full of roasted chestnuts and gossip, ready for the next round. The prosecutor rises, smoothing his faded blue tunic with the air of a man who's been waiting all day to drop his trump card. You're not sure what he's holding behind his back, but based on the glint in his eye, it's either crucial evidence, or a loaf of bread he forgot to put down. He addresses the court. Today, he says grandly, you shall hear from those who suffered most directly at the wings and webbed feet of the accused. He points a dramatic finger toward the goose, who responds with a slow blink and a contemplative gurgle. If the goose is feeling remorse, it hides it behind excellent poker-face plumage. The first witness is a baker named Thibault, whose apron is still dusted with flour. He lumbers up to the stand and launches into a passionate recounting of the day everything went wrong. It was the feast of St. Firmin, he begins. We just laid out the sacramental bread, 3 dozen loaves, golden and perfect. People were gathered. The incense was strong. The bishop was about to bless the table. He pauses, lips quivering slightly, like a man reliving a trauma. And then, honk! A blur of feathers. A waddling blur. The goose ran straight across the altar square, flapping, screeching, knocking over a tray of holy buns. A gasp ripples through the courtroom. Somewhere, A woman crosses herself. Thibault continues. The loaves were ruined. People screamed. I dropped my mixing bowl. It cracked. That bowl had been in my family for generations. He looks close to tears. You can't help but feel for him, even if you're also trying not to snort. The defense objects. Is it not true that the buns were later salvaged and served with goat cheese at the mayor's table? That's not the point, Thibault cries, shaking a floury fist. The judge jots something down. Possibly bun disruption equals moderate offense. Next, a pair of elderly twins take the stand. Agathe and Benoit, sisters well into their 70s, with matching kerchiefs and identical scowls. They speak in a kind of call-and-response rhythm that makes the entire courtroom lean in. It stepped on my rosemary, says Agathe. Crushed the sage too, says Benoit. Bit my ankle. Bit my hand. Made the dog bark for 3 days. At the moon. They both glare at the goose, who appears to be examining a crack in the floor. Their testimony isn't entirely coherent, but it's compelling. You can see the jury, a mix of village elders, a carpenter, and a boy with questionable facial hair, nodding with furrowed brows. Then comes a farmer named Gilbert, whose sunburned face and bent posture speak of a life spent arguing with potatoes. He claims the goose trespassed into his field and disrupted a scarecrow installation. I was trying something new, he explains. Scarecrows shaped like bishops. Thought it'd confuse the crows. A stifled laugh escapes from the scribe. Gilbert scowls. But the goose attacked it. Tore off the mitre. Pooped on the robe. The bishop goes visibly pale. The courtroom falls into an uncomfortable silence. It's hard to say what's more offensive, the act itself, or the bishop being confused with a straw mannequin. Either way, the tension now feels thick enough to carve. Historians still argue whether these witness accounts were ever expected to be fully factual, or if they served more as public storytelling, a way to shape communal memory through ritualized blame. It's clear that the actual sequence of events doesn't matter as much as how the villagers feel about them. And how they feel, apparently, is personally betrayed by poultry. The prosecution continues, this time pulling out a scroll of legal precedent. He reads a case from 1266, in which a sheep was fined for trespassing in a lord's garden. If sheep can be fined, he booms, surely a goose can be punished for desecration. He slams the scroll shut. Dramatic pause. The defense rises, weary but resolute. But was the sheep aware of its wrongdoing? You can feel the air in the room shift. It's the same debate again, awareness versus instinct, crime versus chaos. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, the goose stands up, yes, stands up, spreads its wings wide, and lets out a long, echoing honk that bounces off the stone walls with operatic precision. The courtroom erupts, half the room takes it as proof of guilt. The other half thinks it's a noble protest. One man calls it divine speech. A child declares it a prophecy. The judge bangs his staff repeatedly. Silence. This is a court of law. That's generous, you think, but no one says it out loud. Once calm is restored, the prosecution rests. You glance around and notice the jury members whispering intensely. The carpenter sketches something in the dirt beside his boot. Perhaps he's tallying Goose's sins. Or maybe he's just drawing a duck for irony. The judge announces that deliberations will begin tomorrow. There is to be no more testimony. The court is adjourned. As you file out with the others, you overhear snippets of debate. I think the goose is possessed. Maybe it was provoked. What if it's a test from God? Or from the devil? Or from somewhere in between? It's clear the trial has stirred something deeper than agriculture and festival etiquette. In this tiny village, with its crumbling walls and flickering torches, the goose has become a mirror for everyone's fears, frustrations, and folklore. You walk slowly back through the square. The vendors have packed up, and a hush has settled over the cobblestones. The sky above is ink blue, dotted with early stars. Somewhere in the distance, a barn owl calls. The wind rustles through bare branches, and for a moment, you imagine it whispering, guilty. Or not guilty. You chuckle softly and pull your cloak tighter. Tomorrow, a verdict will be decided. But tonight, the goose sleeps under guard, and you, dear traveler, get to rest with the peculiar knowledge that you've just witnessed one of history's most bizarre legal dramas. Sleep tight. Tomorrow, we judge the goose. Morning arrives like a sigh across the village rooftops. A low mist drapes itself over the fields, softening every edge and muffling every sound, as if the world itself is trying not to wake the goose too early. You pull on your cloak and make your way back to the courthouse. By now, the path is familiar. Past the leaning post where the town crier naps between bell rings, past the inn with its crooked sign and questionable stew, and through the small wooden gate that's permanently stuck halfway open. The villagers are already gathering, whispering in hushed tones, their breath clouding in the cool air. Word has spread that today might be the final hearing. The day the goose learns its fate. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere is thick with anticipation and goose dander. The jury is seated, their expressions somewhere between solemn and confused. The judge looks pale, as though he too realizes he's about to pass judgment on an actual bird. The goose, tethered as usual, preens quietly. It has maintained a consistent level of indifference throughout this entire process, which, frankly, makes it one of the most dignified creatures in the room. Today begins not with arguments, but with a reading. The judge rises and clears his throat, unfolding a parchment heavy with the ink of many scribes. Before we deliberate, he says, we must review the evidence in full, so that the truth may settle, as dust settles on the chapel beams. He proceeds to read aloud. The list is long, and you settle into your seat, letting his voice wash over you like gentle rainfall on a stone path. He lists the charges: crop destruction, ritual disruption, public nuisance. He notes the testimonies: the baker, the bishop, the Rosemary twins. He even includes the silent witness, the chicken, though no conclusions were drawn there. Then, the judge begins recounting the behavior of the goose itself. Throughout these proceedings, he reads, the accused has remained composed. Some would say impassive. However, he continues, this court has noted moments of engagement, honking at dramatic intervals, spreading of wings during moral arguments, a bold stance during the bishop's reading of the epistle. The goose lets out a short puff of air through its nostrils, as if responding to this character summary. At one point, the judge pauses to drink from a pewter cup. The room is so quiet you can hear the scrape of the metal against his teeth. Before deliberations begin, he says slowly, we shall allow one final statement from each side. The prosecutor rises first. His speech is impassioned, but the fire has dimmed since yesterday. He repeats the charges but adds a layer of gravitas now, less about feathers and feces, more about what justice means in a village where law keeps the chaos at bay. If we let this goose go, he asks, what's next? A pig in the vestry? A sheep on the council? Order must be preserved. He sits down, flushed and breathless. Then the defense rises. He stands tall, if a little hunched, and spreads his arms gently as he begins to speak. We live in a world, he says, where storms can take our grain, where wolves can steal our sheep, where fires can gut our homes without warning. Every day we wake, uncertain of what cruelty or blessing the heavens will offer us. You nod slightly, as does the blacksmith seated beside you. But in the midst of all this uncertainty, he says, we try to find patterns. Meaning. Blame. We try to make sense of the nonsensical by pointing to something, someone, and saying, you. You are why things went wrong. He gestures toward the goose, which sneezes delicately. But this goose is not why the crops failed. It is not why the wind blew too hard or why the rain came late. It is just a creature. And if we punish it, we do not restore justice. We pretend, briefly, that the world can be made simple again. A long silence follows. The bishop rubs his temple. The judge breathes slowly, eyes closed. Historians still debate the legal authority of these animal trials, whether they carried binding weight, or if they were communal theater, a kind of ritual exorcism for collective anxieties. But in this room, here and now, it doesn't feel abstract. It feels personal. You watch as the jury is led out to deliberate in a nearby room that doubles as a hay storage shed. It will not be a quick process. One of the elders has opinions about everything, and another has a tendency to fall asleep mid-vote. You drift outside with the other spectators, wandering the muddy courtyard where smoke from chimney fires curls like sleepy snakes through the morning air. Children chase each other with sticks. A dog naps in a wheelbarrow. Someone's playing a sad fiddle near the inn door, because why not add ambience to existential poultry judgment? You sit on a barrel and watch the clouds move. After what feels like hours, but may have only been 40 minutes and a particularly dramatic tea break, the jury returns. The bell tolls once. The townsfolk file back inside, their faces taut with anticipation. The judge stands. "We have reached a verdict," he says. Everyone leans forward. The jury finds the goose guilty of nuisance and disruption of sacred rites. A sharp intake of breath sweeps the room. The goose looks up briefly, as if to say, "Of course you did." But the judge continues, "We also find that no clear owner could be identified, and no malicious intent was proven. Therefore, punishment shall be symbolic. The goose shall be publicly reprimanded and relocated to the monastery gardens, where it shall live under observation." You blink. That's it. The crowd murmurs. A few groans. A few cheers. Someone claps slowly, uncertainly. The bishop looks relieved. The goose stands up, flaps its wings once, and honks. Loudly. Proudly. A full-throated sound that echoes off the rafters and into local legend. You smile. Justice, it seems, is feathered and oddly diplomatic. As the courtroom begins to empty, villagers return to their chores and routines, forever changed, or at least mildly entertained, by the time they witness the law put on a goose's shoulders. Outside, the sun has finally broken through the clouds. Light spills onto the square, warming the stones beneath your feet. Somewhere in the distance, bells ring for the noon meal. And somewhere behind the abbey wall, a goose waddles freely among the herbs, sentenced not to death, but to supervised gardening. You stretch, yawn, and wander off for lunch. But don't get too comfortable. This tale isn't over yet. Because now, the village has opinions. Loud ones. And you're about to hear every last one. The verdict has been delivered, the courtroom has emptied, and the goose, now a figure of oddly elevated status, has taken up residence in the monastery garden. But peace doesn't last long in a town that just watched a bird go through the full medieval legal system. You're barely halfway through your noonday turnip pie when the whispers begin. By the time you finish chewing, the gossip has already achieved the structural integrity of a cathedral. Villagers swarm the square in tight little knots of conversation, gesturing with bread, waving ladles in midair, and invoking saints with wild abandon. And just like that, the goose trial becomes a folk tale in real time. You stroll past a group of farmers gathered around the well. One of them is swearing up and down that the verdict was too soft. Reprimanded? That bird should have been feathered and stuffed, he says, without a trace of irony. What kind of example does this set for the geese of tomorrow? Another chimes in, insisting that letting the goose off lightly means next year's feast of Saint Firmin will be cursed. Mark my words, no barley will rise come spring. The fields will smell like vinegar, and the cows will walk backwards. A third farmer, chewing a suspiciously dark apple, adds with authority, they should have just held a duck off. Geese hate being outperformed by ducks. You back away slowly, as the conversation turns toward organizing a citizens' poultry council. The gossip spreads like fire in a thatched roof. At the bakery, Thibault the breadsmith tells anyone who'll listen that the goose was definitely in league with forest spirits. I saw it blink sideways. That's not how normal birds blink. In the tavern, two monks are deep in heated debate over whether the goose's honk during the verdict was a sign of remorse or a challenge to ecclesiastical authority. It sounded too intentional, says one, stabbing a sausage for emphasis. Almost like Latin. And at the tailor's shop, you overhear Agath and Benoit explaining that the goose is obviously enchanted. Has to be. No natural bird lives that long with such perfect posture. Historians still debate whether trials like these were meant to reinforce legal order or just give small communities a chance to process collective stress through a shared, absurd event. What's clear is that in this village, the trial has become more than justice. It's folklore in the making. You pass a boy carving the goose's likeness into a bit of old wood. A girl nearby sings a little song that rhymes feathered sinner with breadwinner. A teenage apprentice is sketching what looks like a dramatic fresco of the trial, complete with fiery judgment clouds and a haloed chicken. As absurd as it is, there's something oddly comforting about it all. The world may be confusing, but people are good at weaving narrative nests to keep the chaos out. Even if the main character is a bird. Later that evening, a town meeting is called. Not officially, of course, just one of those spontaneous gatherings that happens when enough people want to argue and everyone's bored of counting firewood. You squeeze into the town hall, a squat stone building that smells like onions and wax, and listen as opinions are flung about like old cabbage. The goose got off easy. The bishop should have let it do penance. That goose is smarter than the lot of us. We should have trained it to guard the grain silo. And then, from the corner, a new voice rises, quieter, but more curious. What if, says the village teacher, a man with spectacles and patience far beyond the norm, the goose was never the point at all? The room pauses. He goes on, what if we just needed a place to focus all our fears? The weather's been wrong. The harvest was weak. The taxes are getting worse. Maybe the goose was just convenient. The silence holds for a moment longer, then collapses under the weight of Agath yelling, convenient? That beast bit my hand. Still, the idea lands. You watch as the crowd's energy shifts. The laughter turns softer. The voices drop a pitch. The spectacle of it all is fading, and now the town is left with something more delicate, reflection. Of course, this doesn't stop them from arguing. One man insists that the goose should be elected to the council. Another proposes starting a new feast day, Goose Judgment Day, complete with parades and bird-shaped cakes. It's a toss-up whether the town has learned anything at all. Eventually, the meeting breaks up. You slip outside into the cool evening air. The moon is bright tonight, turning the cobbled square silver. You walk past the courthouse, where someone has scratched a crude goose silhouette onto the door. Underneath it, justice, feathered and firm. You smile. Then you decide to visit the monastery garden. Just a peek. Just to see if the star of the whole saga is still awake. You walk quietly along the gravel path, the lantern in your hand throwing soft yellow light ahead of you. The garden is peaceful, lined with herbs and simple flowers. A faint breeze carries the scent of rosemary and sage. There, near the low stone wall, you spot it. The goose, asleep beside a wooden bucket, head tucked neatly under wing, breathing slow and steady. No guards. No restraints. Just a bird, living out its sentence among basil and mint. You crouch nearby and watch for a moment, listening to the tiny rustle of feathers, the distant chirp of crickets, and the occasional snore from amongst cell. It's nice. Calming, even. And you wonder, how many strange little towns held strange little trials like this, and then quietly forgot them? How many villages once watched a pig, a cow, or a goat take the stand, then turn the tale into something softer? A story? A bedtime legend? A joke that became tradition? A whispered line, "Don't make me bring you to Goose Court." You rise, stretch, and wander back toward your inn. The trial is over. The court is closed. But the story, it seems, has only just begun. Because starting tomorrow, every time someone loses a boot, burns a pie, or gets rained on during a holy procession, someone else is going to say, well, it could be worse, you could be that goose. And that goose? It's going to become a legend. The days pass slowly in the village, wrapped in the damp, musky scent of autumn decay. The leaves turn brittle and fall like parchment scraps from the old abbey ledger. The goose, now living in the monastery gardens, has settled into a life of contemplative waddling, supervised You remain in town longer than expected, partly because your horse threw a shoe, partly because you can't quite bring yourself to leave. There's something magnetic about this place, and its strange moment in history, still echoing in every idle conversation and clumsily carved goose effigy nailed to a doorpost. And now, curiosity has drawn you deeper. You're in the Abbey scriptorium, nose inches from a brittle codex as a monk with surprisingly clean hands slides another scroll across the table. You wanted to know if this kind of thing happened often? He says, barely whispering. Oh yes, you murmur, adjusting your position on a bench that might be more plank than seat. The scroll unrolls with a dry rustle, and the heading reads, On the case of the pig of Pont l'Evêque, year of our Lord 1386. You blink. Another trial? The monk nods gravely. It trampled a child. Mauled him, they said. It was dressed in breeches and a waistcoat for the hanging. You don't even try to suppress your disbelief. And yet, it's real. Or real enough. You scan the text. The details are eerily familiar. Public trial, formal sentencing, and an unnerving amount of commentary on the pig's moral choices. People swore the animal acted with malice aforethought. It was buried, of course, but not in consecrated ground. You look up at the monk. Was that normal? He shrugs in a monkish way. In France? More than you'd think. You stay for hours, poring over records with ink-stiffened corners and faded seals. You learn of cows fined for kicking priests. Donkeys excommunicated for impropriety. Hordes of insects brought to court and asked, to leave vineyards under threat of spiritual banishment. It's all there, inked by hands long turned to dust. Some are cases argued by trained lawyers. Others by priests with more time than theological restraint. Some of the accused were executed. Some were driven away. Others were simply cursed. You find yourself spiraling into the peculiar legal and spiritual philosophy of the time. Animals, you discover, were classified differently depending on their behavior. Domesticated beasts, like cows, pigs, and yes, geese, were sometimes viewed as moral agents. Why? Because they lived alongside humans, ate human food, responded to commands. In other words, they should know better. Wild animals, however, were treated more like forces of nature. Swarms of mice might be excommunicated, but not hanged. That would be absurd, obviously. Historians still argue whether this distinction truly reflected belief or was just legal storytelling taken to extremes. Some claim that these trials were symbolic, designed to reassert human control in a fragile world. Others believe the medieval mind made no such distinction, that guilt could cling to any creature, feathered or furred. It all sounds unbelievable, until you remember, these people lived in a world where plagues walked like ghosts, where storms arrived without warning, and where a bad oat crop could mean death. In that world, justice didn't just keep people in line, it kept the void at bay. The next day, you speak to Brother Amand, the Abbey's resident theologian, who looks like a walking stack of vellum and sandals. He leads you into the library's locked cabinet, and, after some muttering and key turning, presents a peculiar tome titled De Culpa Animalium, on the guilt of animals. It's a dense, Latin-heavy work filled with scribbled marginalia and the occasional doodle of a very angry goat. But one passage catches your eye. It suggests that certain animals, when raised among men, could absorb their sinful ways, especially if fed with the fruits of pride, greed, and idle chatter. You sit with that for a moment. The idea that proximity to humanity could corrupt a creature, that sharing our bread and our barn could infect them with our failings. Brother Ammon shrugs. Some monks believe that pigs were particularly susceptible, as if they lacked the spiritual armor of more noble beasts. You glance out the narrow window, toward the garden, where the goose is busy harassing a clump of lavender with admirable focus. Could it be that geese were, in medieval minds, somewhere between creature and companion? Not noble, like a hunting hound. Not wild, like a fox. Just close enough to know better. Just far enough to still be blamed. Later that afternoon, you take a stroll through the village again. The trial may be over, but the aftershocks haven't faded. You pass by a carpenter's shop where someone's carving small wooden birds, each wearing a tiny painted cap. One has a scroll tucked under its wing. A woman buys 3. At the inn, the barmaid pours you a drink and asks, "Did you know we're now calling our goose ale the Feathered Felon?" Sold out twice. Even the bishop has softened, referring to the goose now as that misguided but spirited soul. There's talk of letting it roam the cloister freely during certain feast days. You chuckle. This whole village has gone a little bit goose-mad. And yet, they seem more at peace now. Like the trial, absurd as it was, gave everyone a place to put their worry, their grief, their hope that the world might still make sense if you just explained it sternly to a bird. That night, back in your narrow bed, you think of how strange and comforting it is that a single animal could hold so much meaning for so many people. Not because it's sacred. Not because it's dangerous. But because it gave the village something to hold on to. Something to name. Something to forgive. And maybe, in a way, it gave them permission to forgive themselves, for the bad harvest, for the sick children, for the prayers that didn't seem to work. If even a goose can be judged, maybe even a goose can be redeemed. You fall asleep to the sound of distant honking and a rooster practicing his morning call 5 hours too early. The next morning your boots squelch through dew-soaked earth as you make your way across the sleepy village square. The air is sharp and clean, laced with chimney smoke and the scent of last night's spilled cider. The cobblestones are quieter now, no shouting vendors, no flocks of townsfolk huddled in corners trading goose trial theories. But if you pause and listen, you can still hear it in the rustling whispers, the story's alive, pulsing just beneath the surface. You've decided to take a small detour from the goose for the day. Not because you're tired of it, how could you be? But because you've begun to realize that this wasn't some one-time village absurdity. Animal trials weren't a freak occurrence. They were a whole genre of justice, and you're ready to collect the greatest hits. You find yourself in the home of a retired bailiff named Marin, a man with 3 teeth, infinite opinions, and a collection of dusty scrolls so large it's been sorted by smell. He pours you something warm and herbal, maybe tea, maybe diluted soup, and grins as he unfurls a parchment marked with looping, water-warped script. "Ever hear about the sow that was burned at the stake in Rouen?" he asks casually. You blink. "A pig burned?" "Indeed," he says, tapping the scroll. "Killed a child. Witnesses claimed it dragged the poor thing by the arm." He shrugs. "Some pigs just snap." The case is chilling, and real. The pig was arrested, jailed, tried, and sentenced. But what makes it even stranger is what happened after. The local lord ordered clothing be made for the execution, a tiny tunic and breeches, stitched specially for the occasion. A crowd gathered. Priests recited prayers. It wasn't just punishment. It was performance. You try to imagine it, a pig, dressed like a person, dragged through the square, blamed for something tragic no one could understand. Perhaps that was the point. To make grief visible. To give the crowd something physical to mourn. Or to blame. Later, Marin shows you another case, one even stranger, a group of field mice excommunicated in 1510 from a village in Savoy. Their crime? Destroying grain stores. The local priest conducted a trial, defense, charges, and all, then issued a decree demanding the mice leave the village under threat of divine wrath. They didn't, Marin adds deadpan. Historians still argue whether anyone actually believed the excommunication would work. Some scholars think it was symbolic, a ritual meant to restore balance with nature or invoke divine protection. Others suspect it was more about giving the villagers something to do when crops failed and the skies wouldn't cooperate. Either way, it happened. And it wasn't the only time. As the day unfolds, Marin brings out more records. A rooster accused of laying an egg, a magical one, allegedly. Townsfolk believed it was a harbinger of witchcraft, since roosters, by nature, do not lay eggs. The poor bird was tried and burned. Unsurprisingly, no one double-checked the biology. There was a dog sentenced to death for stealing bread, a goat accused of sorcery after it danced in a circle, and a donkey that, well, interrupted a sermon with such timing and theatricality that the priest called it Satan's messenger. All of them stood trial. All of them were judged as if they understood the rules, the rituals, the sins they'd allegedly committed. The absurdity hits you in waves. And yet, each story carries a strange ache beneath the surface. These were desperate people, in difficult times, trying to impose order on a world that often refused to play along. Blaming an animal meant someone could be punished. Something could be ended. A wound, however metaphorical, could be stitched closed. That evening, as the sun begins its slow dive behind the hills, you sit on the low wall outside Marin's home, watching smoke rise from distant chimneys. The village below hums gently, clattering pots, murmured songs, a goat bleating with operatic conviction. You wonder, how many of these stories were ever truly believed? How many were half-jokes that spiraled into ceremony? Did the people watching these trials truly think the animals held guilt in their hearts? Or were they just looking for something, anything, to explain why the barley failed, or why their child had fallen ill? You pass a small shrine on the way back to your inn. It's new, only a few days old. You recognize the rough carving on the wooden board, a goose, wings spread in mid-honk, surrounded by hand-painted flowers. At its feet, someone has placed a crust of bread. An offering? A joke? A thank you? Maybe all three. Inside the inn, the fire crackles in the hearth. The innkeeper serves you a bowl of stew and plunks down beside you with a sigh. You hear what happened in Fauger's last spring? He asks casually. Horse trampled the altar boy's foot during Palm Sunday. Someone tried to summon a tribunal before the bishop shut it down. You raise your eyebrows. He chuckles. Said it was too modern a town for that sort of thing now. But you can tell he's a little disappointed. The village might have laughed, cried, debated. Come together. Learn something. Like your goose trial. Like all the others. He finishes his drink and mutters, still think animals understand more than we give them credit for. You nod. You're starting to think the same. Because behind the nonsense, behind the feathered defendants and clucking chaos, there's something surprisingly, somewhere out there, the goose dreams, perhaps of grain, perhaps of freedom, perhaps of tiny wooden gavels. And you? You dream of pigs in waistcoats, mice with scrolls, and an entire legal system built on the idea that even chaos can be reasoned with. You wake the next morning to soft sunlight spilling across the stone floor, broken by the thin lines of the shutters. Outside, the village hums its sleepy tune, cartwheels groaning, a distant rooster shrieking into the void, and yes, a familiar, stately honk. The goose, it seems, is up before you, probably practicing its courtroom glare in the reflection of a pond. Today, the story returns to that feathered icon. Specifically, to what happened during the final days of the trial, when the goose, defiant as ever, had its moment of personal rebellion. Because while most animals on trial sat passively, quiet, trembling, or totally indifferent, this goose, it fought back. It began, as these things often do, with a hat. On what was supposed to be a particularly solemn court day, when a high-ranking bishop from Dijon had traveled all the way to preside over a portion of the proceedings, the courthouse was packed. Nobles, scribes, a few visiting monks hoping to write about it later with words like heretofore an abomination. And right in the middle, in its makeshift pen, stood the accused, a goose whose patience had evidently expired. The bishop had just launched into a Latin invocation about divine order and the sanctity of ritual law when the goose, perhaps bored or perhaps deeply offended by his Latin accent, decided to act. It stretched its neck forward, waddled up to the side of its pen, and, with perfect timing, reached out and snatched the bishop's hat. Not nibbled. Not nudged. Snatched. Witnesses would later disagree on the specifics. Some said it was a slow, sneaky grab. Others swore it was a lightning-fast strike, like divine justice delivered via beak. One woman claimed the goose reared back and launched it like a discus. Regardless, the hat flew off the bishop's head and landed with a spectacular plop into the mud outside. The room froze. For several seconds, all that could be heard was the faint dripping of wax from a candelabra and the high-pitched wheeze of a scribe trying very hard not to laugh. The bishop turned crimson. The goose let out a long, triumphant honk. Pandemonium. A pageboy fainted. The defense lawyer panicked. The prosecutor stood up shouting about contempt of court. And someone near the back, possibly a jester moonlighting as a candlemaker, muttered, "Well, now it's personal." You can still see the scuff marks on the courthouse floor where several people tripped trying to retrieve the hat. The bishop, already furious that his role in the trial had been questioned by local clergy, took the incident as a clear sign of spiritual warfare. For a full week afterward, he insisted that the goose was not merely disruptive, but possessed of a rebellious and unrepentant soul. That was a real phrase. Several people embroidered it on handkerchiefs and sold them outside the tavern. Historians still argue whether the goose's behavior was interpreted symbolically or just considered deeply annoying. Some accounts suggest villagers began seeing it as an avatar of protest, an unwilling scapegoat who dared to challenge authority. Others saw the hat incident as confirmation that the bird was mocking their sacred institutions, an insult that required swift and heavy judgment. But the goose? It just strutted around its enclosure afterward like nothing had happened. Like it didn't just trigger a full-blown theological crisis. In the days that followed, paranoia bloomed like mold on old bread. One monk accused the goose of trying to distract the bishop to halt the trial. Another claimed that the bird had winked at him, and that it was a sign of. It didn't help that the goose refused to show the proper posture expected during prayer hours. When the bishop demanded it be turned toward the altar during a short blessing service, the goose not only turned its back, it promptly relieved itself on a borrowed hymnal. And yet, despite all this, despite the hat snatching, the refusal to repent, the general air of smugness, the court continued its ritual with as much seriousness as it could muster. The final testimonies shifted in tone. Less about justice, more about frustration. One woman declared the goose a feathered harbinger of social decay. A local priest said the trial was cursed and began speaking exclusively in proverbs for the next 3 days. A bird that bites the bishop sings no ave, he said at one point, which, while catchy, is utterly meaningless. Still, the judge insisted the proceedings be completed by the book. At one point, someone suggested using animal divination to determine the goose's fate, letting it walk freely among 3 colored sheets of cloth, each symbolizing a different sentence: forgiveness, exile, or stew. The judge rejected the idea, though not without noting it might have yielded more clarity than the bishop's last sermon. You start to realize that what began as a structured legal affair has now turned into something looser, stranger. A performance, a pressure valve, a communal dream that no one quite knows how to end. And that's when the debates start, not about guilt, but about meaning. One friar insists the goose represents the common man, voiceless, bound by systems it doesn't understand, and yet still capable of upsetting power with a well-timed peck. Another thinks the goose is a cautionary tale. Give chaos too much room, and soon everyone's hats are in the mud. Even the scribe adds a line to his margins: perhaps we are the goose, and the court is our field. No one knows what he meant, but it sounded wise, so now it's quoted during meal blessings. Back in the monastery garden, the goose continues its life under observational exile. It's not exactly a harsh sentence. There's ample sunlight, monks who sneak at bits of barley cake, and a particularly arrogant duck it seems to enjoy bullying. Villagers come by in the evenings, lingering by the fence to watch. Children toss breadcrumbs and giggle when it honks. A few women claim the goose brings luck if it looks you in the eye. One man insists he saw it bow during Vespers, though that may have been the wind. And yet you can't help but think, perhaps the goose knew exactly what it was doing. Perhaps that act of rebellion, that perfectly timed theft of a bishop's dignity, was the purest statement it could make. Not just a disruption, but a declaration: you can try me, but you can't understand me. You lie in bed that night, turning over the image in your mind, the bishop's face, the goose's triumphant pose, the townsfolk's astonishment. It's absurd. It's brilliant. And it makes you wonder, if one goose, in one sleepy village, can spark this much chaos, How many other forgotten animals once stood proud in the middle of history, only to be remembered as a punchline? But not this goose. This one snatched a bishop's hat. And the story's only getting better. Morning light cuts through a patchwork of clouds as you wake to the sound of gentle church bells and a rather smug honk drifting in from the direction of the monastery garden. You're starting to suspect that this goose, now a village celebrity, ecclesiastical troublemaker, and part-time herb garden enthusiast, has discovered a deeper purpose. Over breakfast, you sip something warm and mildly questionable and ponder a thought that's been slowly pecking at the back of your mind. Was this whole trial ever really about law at all? You take a stroll through the now infamous courthouse, still open to curious townsfolk who stop in just to point at the goose pen and say things like, "That's where it happened," or "I knew from the start she was trouble." The pen is empty now, of course, except for a single white feather left behind like a forgotten calling card. You make your way toward the village records room, a dusty chamber above the scribe's quarters that smells of beeswax, mildew, and modest ambition. There, you find Father Renaud, the village archivist, currently elbow-deep in parchment scrolls and muttering something about missing ink pots and mice with questionable morals. He offers you a stool and a stack of documents he claims are legally adjacent. You unroll one and begin reading, only to find yourself tumbling headfirst into the curious concept of animal justice as performance art. Because yes, there's a pattern emerging, one that goes far beyond France's borders. You learn that in many cases, these animal trials were not just about finding guilt or innocence, but about reinforcing the moral structure of the world itself. Like a pageant. A grim bedtime story. A morality play with extra feathers. Take, for instance, the story of the donkey in 15th century Switzerland, brought to court for conduct unbecoming of a Christian household. There was never an official charge. No one even tried to define what the donkey had done. But everyone agreed it had behaved poorly for too long. And what followed? A ceremony, not unlike a trial, where townsfolk gathered, witnesses spoke, and a symbolic sentence was issued: exile. The donkey was paraded out of town with minor theatrics and a wreath of onions around its neck. The village cheered. Justice, of a sort, had been served. Father Renaud, adjusting his glasses, leans in and says, in those days, trials like these were more than judicial. They were spiritual choreography. You raise an eyebrow. He nods. People needed ritual. The church had its sacraments. The nobles had their coronations. But the villagers? They needed something too. Something to remind them that the world could still be made sense of, even if it meant dragging a goat in front of a magistrate. And suddenly, things start to click into place. You think back to the Goose trial. The audience, the solemn declarations, the slow unfolding of testimony. The way the judge seemed almost less interested in truth and more in pacing. The church's thunderous involvement. The public's need to interpret every flap and honk like it held the secrets of divine order. It wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a script. One they performed before. One they needed to perform again. Historians still argue whether these rituals were cathartic tools of power or grassroots efforts to control fear. Some suggest the trials allowed the church to extend its influence over rural communities in symbolic ways. Others argue it was the villagers who initiated these cases, turning trial into theater to process their chaos and confusion. Either way, the people in these towns weren't fools. They knew the Goose didn't read canon law. They weren't sincerely trying to teach legal principles to livestock. But they were trying to make sense of the world around them, to wrestle fear into narrative, and to point to a honking scapegoat and say, there. That's what went wrong. Back in the records room, you find one final scroll that makes your jaw tighten. It's a transcript, fragmented, but clear, of a late 14th century trial involving a flock of crows that allegedly consorted with witches during a famine. The villagers gave testimony, yes. But what stands out is the final sentence. Though the crows are dumb beasts, their presence serves to remind us. when we forget our duties, the creatures of the wild come to mock us. You sit with that for a moment. It was never about the birds. It was always about the people. You thank Father Renaud and step outside, the midday sun soft on your face. Across the square, you spot the goose in the garden, flanked by two small children tossing seeds and giggling as it pecks politely. Nearby, a merchant explains to a traveler that yes, this is the goose, and yes, it really did make a bishop cry. You wander closer, crouching near the low wall, and watch as the goose, who is no longer merely a goose, but a symbol, a punchline, a saint to some and a nuisance to others, pauses its pecking and glances your way. You meet its eyes. For the briefest moment, you wonder what it sees. A spectator? A chronicler? Or just a mildly intrusive human carrying too many opinions? The goose blinks. You blink back. Then it honks. Loudly. Once. Solemn and final, like the clang of a courtroom bell or the punchline to a joke you weren't quite ready for. You can't help but grin. Because now you understand what happened in that courtroom. It wasn't about proving whether a goose could sin, or whether a bishop could forgive, or even whether a bakery bun counted as sacred. It was about finding meaning in the mess. About standing together and naming the absurdity aloud. About restoring, in some small and feathered way, the idea that the universe could be set right again, even if just for a day. And you suspect that's why people keep returning to the story, keep carving little wooden geese, keep singing songs in the tavern about the one who honked last. Because deep down, they know the truth. The goose was never guilty. It was necessary. The next morning, the village stirs under a damp, wool-gray sky. Chimneys puff small clouds of smoke, the earth glistens with a thin layer of overnight drizzle, and the gravel crunches under your boots as you approach the courthouse again. Today is the day of reckoning, not for the goose, but for the people who must now decide what, if anything, they learn from it. The trial may be over, but the final chapter has yet to be written. The judge, after several days of quiet contemplation, has summoned the jury back to the courthouse to deliver the formal closing of the case. You push open the heavy wooden doors and step inside, greeted by the familiar smell of damp stone, burnt tallow, and old wood soaked in legal drama. The benches are half full already. Villagers sit shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in shawls and speculation. You recognize nearly all of them by now, every furrowed brow, every half-whispered "this ought to be good." The judge appears, as always, through the side door like a reluctant schoolmaster. He settles into his creaky chair with the careful slowness of someone very aware of how symbolic today is supposed to feel. With no fanfare, no gavel, and not even a dramatic pause, he clears his throat and says, "Verdict stands. Judgment was made. But now comes the reckoning." You sit up straighter. Around you, heads tilt and eyebrows lift. The judge gestures to a sheet of parchment, fresh, ink still glistening. What follows is not law, but learning. Let this be recorded not as punishment, but as parable. He begins to read aloud, not in the stiff tone of a court official but in a rhythm closer to storytelling. The jury has composed a collective statement, and it's part confession, part closing argument, part village therapy session. It recounts the trial, yes, the accusations, the honks, the chaos, but more importantly, it reflects on what the trial meant. For them. For their town. For the tiny sliver of the world they call home. You find yourself unexpectedly moved. The statement begins by acknowledging the original charges: crop destruction, ritual disruption, public nuisance. These, the parchment reads, were the visible causes. The scabs atop deeper itches. And then it dives into what lay beneath. The harvest was poor, the weather erratic. The bishop's sermons had grown longer, and the bread thinner. People were tired, anxious, and quietly afraid. And into that anxious stillness waddled the goose. The goose, the statement says, became the story we needed. A mirror of absurdity. A vessel for our unrest. Historians still argue whether the conclusions drawn in such statements were genuine insights or simply post hoc rationalizations. But it's clear this jury took their task seriously. One line stands out, penned perhaps by the carpenter, whose rough hands belied a poet's heart. To try the goose was to try ourselves, and find that we, too, are driven by instinct, fear, and hunger. You let those words settle into your chest. Around you, people nod slowly, visibly moved in the strange, sleepy way that only courtroom philosophy delivered by candlelight can produce. The statement concludes with a simple declaration: may no beast ever stand alone again for burdens that belong to us all. And with that, the judge rolls up the parchment, seals it with a drop of red wax, and nods. Let the record show, he says, that the matter of the goose is now closed. But the people don't rise. They don't shuffle out, grumble, or return to their carts and cabbages. Instead, there's a pause, a long, thoughtful silence that holds the whole room in its palm. Then someone in the back clears their throat and softly says, "She's still in the garden, right?" The judge smiles faintly. "She is." I say we thank her. Laughter ripples, soft and warm. But the idea, ridiculous as it sounds, catches. One by one, people begin to murmur agreement. And so it is decided, with the kind of improvised logic that governs the best and worst of village decisions. There will be a goose procession. It's assembled within the hour. You watch, bemused and delighted, as someone brings out flower garlands. Children collect scraps of ribbon. The baker carries a tray of warm rolls. The twins, Agath and Benoit, are sewing something suspiciously like a tiny feathered cape. The procession begins at the square. The goose, having been coaxed out of the herb patch with a handful of peas and a lot of pleading, is gently placed onto a small, wheeled cart. It's decorated with ivy, a few daisies, and what might be a blessed ladle. A young boy leads the cart, holding a carved staff with a goose figurine at the top. Everyone else follows. The bishop, perhaps feeling pressure to be gracious, joins the walk, carrying a censer and muttering something about divine irony. The judge walks beside him, robes slightly askew. And you? You walk near the middle, part of the wave of humanity trailing after a creature who now represents something much bigger than itself. The goose honks only once, just before they reach the chapel steps, as if to say, "This better be good." They place the cart before the altar. The crowd quiets. The baker steps forward and offers a loaf of honey bread. A child places a drawing at the goose's feet. The judge speaks a short benediction, neither religious nor legal, just kind. Then, most remarkably, the bishop kneels. He removes his new hat, firmly secured this time, and bows his head before the goose. "We are not always wise," he says softly, "but perhaps we are willing to learn." The goose blinks. The village applauds. You leave the chapel later with cheeks aching from smiling. Something strange and wonderful has happened here, something that you suspect will ripple far beyond this season's harvest or next year's winter. The goose is wheeled back to the monastery garden, greeted like a weary hero. A small wooden sign is hammered into the soil beside its favorite bush. It reads, "The Goose of Judgment, retired." You visit it once more before dusk. It's dozing, tucked into a cozy pile of and you wonder, once again, whether it ever truly knew the part it played in this grand, absurd ballet of belief, ritual, and rebellion. But maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe the goose was never meant to understand. Maybe we were. The next morning dawns with a faint drizzle and a sky the color of old wool. It's the kind of weather that makes you linger in bed longer than necessary, debating whether it's worth putting on boots or just rolling back into dreams. But curiosity wins again. You rise, dress, and make your way back to the heart of the village, where the story of the goose still clings to doorframes, market stalls, and casual conversation like smoke from a candle just blown out. Because although the ceremony is over, the goose is no longer on trial, and the townspeople have seemingly found closure, there's one piece left, one ceremonial thread that still dangles. The sentence itself. You remember clearly, The goose was declared guilty, but not sentenced to death. Instead, it was assigned a form of symbolic punishment. A public reprimand. Relocation. A life of peaceful observation under monastic care. No gallows. No stew pot. No exile into the woods. But symbolic sentences carry a different kind of weight. The weight of story. And in this case, the execution never came, but the ritual of punishment still needed to be seen. So on this rainy morning, you return to witness the final ritual, the formal pronouncement of the sentence. It's not held in the courthouse this time, nor even the church. It takes place in the village square, under a canvas canopy stretched between 4 poles, flapping softly in the breeze. A makeshift platform has been built from hay bales and wooden crates. Someone has painted a crude sign above it that reads, "Let justice be seen, even for geese." You take your place among the crowd. It's smaller today, just a couple dozen villagers, some clergy, the judge, and the goose herself, who is led into the square in what can only be described as a tiny ceremonial harness made from repurposed apron straps. The judge steps forward. He clears his throat, which sets off a ripple of coughs among the crowd. Then he begins, reading from a short scroll with the practiced cadence of someone trying not to trip over words like reproach and heretofore. Be it known, he says, that the goose, formerly unnamed, now referred to as the accused, has been judged guilty of ritual disruption, mischief in sacred places, and crop interference under the moon of Saint Firmin. The goose stands still, watching a beetle crawl across the hay with clear disinterest. However, the judge continues, this court, in its mercy and wisdom, does not seek blood, only balance. Therefore, the following shall be done in fulfillment of sentence. He produces a small piece of paper and reads it aloud. The goose shall receive a formal scolding before the village, in the presence of witnesses, and be instructed in proper conduct. Then, the goose shall be taken to the monastery gardens to begin her life of quiet reflection, with weekly observations to ensure good behavior and abstention from further sacrilegious honking. A few villagers chuckle. The goose honks once. And then comes the most surreal part. A monk, Brother Sebastian, who has drawn the short straw of dignity, steps forward and solemnly looks the goose in the eyes. Goose, he says, voice serious, you have caused disruption, offended the bishop, and frightened children. You may be unaware of your actions, but their effects were real. The goose blinks. You are hereby reprimanded. Let your wings be folded in peace, and your beak stay shut during processions. He raises one hand and points to the monastery. May your days in the garden be calm, and your feathers free from pride. There is a pause. Then, someone in the crowd begins to clap. It's slow, almost sarcastic at first, but it catches. One by one, villagers join in, not loud or boisterous, but warm. Approving. Even the bishop gives a reluctant nod, though he keeps one hand protectively on his hat. The goose, apparently satisfied, fluffs her feathers and pecks the ground, as if to say, that'll do. You watch as she's led gently back toward the monastery by a pair of stable boys who have taken to calling her your honkness. She walks with the serene confidence of someone who has faced judgment, and come out the other side with a fan base. And just like that, the punishment is complete. No gallows. No blood. Just a ritual, absurd and oddly touching, like a fairy tale whispered backwards. As the villagers disperse, you hear them talking. Not bad, as trials go. At least it ended peacefully. I still say we name the next harvest ale after her. And then, do you remember the pig trial of '87? Now that was dramatic. Because of course, this wasn't the first time. And it won't be the last. Historians still argue whether medieval communities truly saw these symbolic punishments as justice, or whether they simply needed closure in a way that felt tangible, visible. The verdict mattered less than the ritual of seeing it carried out. People want endings they can point to. They want to watch the page turn. Even if the page is squawking. Later you find yourself wandering the monastery gardens again. The air smells of damp soil and mint. The goose is already there, pecking lazily at a patch of dandelions. A few novices nearby are sketching her in their journals, perhaps for theological reflection, perhaps for fun. One of them turns to you and says, "Do you think she understands?" You consider it. "No," you reply. "But she endured it anyway." The novice nods. "That's enough sometimes." You sit on a low stone bench and watch the goose continue her routine, occasionally honking, occasionally chasing butterflies, occasionally staring off into the distance like a philosopher who's seen too much. And for a moment, everything is still. The villagers have moved on. The court has closed its books. The bishop has returned to his cathedral. But the story lingers. The feathered defendant, the ridiculous dignity of it all, the way a community came together to perform an act of shared madness that somehow stitched them closer. You smile. Because you know the tale won't end here. Someone will tell it again at a tavern. A child will reenact it with puppets. A scholar centuries later will stumble on the record and wonder how it ever came to be. And somewhere, deep in the annals of absurd human history, it will be written. On this day, in a village not unlike yours, a goose was tried, sentenced, and reprimanded, formally, politely, and with an audience. And perhaps, just perhaps, the world made sense for a moment. You awaken to the clatter of wooden wheels, the rhythmic squeak of a poorly oiled axle, and the unmistakable sound of villagers preparing for something. You peer out your window. There in the square, a potato cart, old, rickety, and freshly decorated with ribbons and sprigs of thyme, is being pulled into place by 2 oxen and a goat who clearly didn't sign up for this job. Execution day? Well, symbolic execution day. Because although the verdict spared the goose any actual capital punishment, medieval ceremony has a certain flair for drama. The people, still buzzing with post-trial energy, have insisted on a formalized send-off, a faux execution, if you will. Not to kill, but to close the loop. You stretch, smile, and throw on your cloak. You wouldn't miss this for the world. By the time you arrive in the square, the energy is oddly celebratory. It feels less like the somber march to gallows and more like a festival had a baby with a morality play. The goose, of course, is the star of the show. She's seated, on a velvet cushion atop the potato cart, tied loosely with a red ribbon more decorative than functional. Her feathers have been brushed, and someone has even attached a tiny laurel wreath to her head. She looks less like a criminal and more like the grand marshal of a highly confusing parade. The baker offers buns to onlookers. A group of children perform a short, slightly chaotic reenactment of the trial using wooden spoons and sock puppets. A teenager in a bishop's hat plays the part of the judge and keeps forgetting his lines. It doesn't matter. The crowd eats it up. At the front of the cart walks the town crier, ringing a bell that's barely louder than his voice. "Hear ye! Hear ye!" He shouts. The goose of Auden proceeds to the site of her penance. Behind the cart, villagers trail like a strange, reverent tale, clergy, farmers, merchants, children waving feathers on sticks. A few visiting monks sketch the scene frantically, one muttering about perfect allegory and journal submission deadlines. You fall in step with the crowd, taking it all in. And you realize, this isn't about punishment. It never really was. It's about release, about drawing a clear line between the tension of the past few weeks and the clean slate of whatever comes next. A goose trial is one thing. A goose execution, even a pretend one, offers closure with flair. Historians still debate the purpose of these symbolic punishments. Some argue they were a form of controlled catharsis, ritualized events meant to absorb communal anxiety and burn it away in spectacle. Others insist it was all about power and pageantry, the ruling class showing they could bend even nonsense into a tool for control. And perhaps both are true. Perhaps the people needed to laugh and to obey. The cart stops at the edge of town, near the old stone gallows. A hush falls. The goose is lifted, carefully, respectfully, from her cushion and placed in a small wooden cage that sits atop a platform. The cage is decorated with herbs, ribbons, and a small wooden plaque that reads, "Here stood she, judged but spared." A friar steps forward to deliver a final blessing. We do not end her, he says solemnly, for she is already transformed. From creature of mischief to creature of meaning. A murmured amen drifts through the air. Then the judge speaks, not from a scroll, but from memory. This sentence is not death, he says, but remembrance. Let the record show, the goose has borne our folly, our fury, our need to find meaning where none was promised. She has stood trial so that we might find peace. You blink. It's poetic. A little ridiculous. But poetic. Then, with great ceremony, the cage door is opened. The goose, perhaps sensing the dramatic beat, pauses for a moment, fluffs her feathers, and then steps regally out onto the platform. The crowd watches in silence. She takes one step forward. Then another. Then she hops down from the platform, and promptly begins chasing the goat who pulled her cart. The goat bolts. The goose honks triumphantly and charges. Chaos erupts. The crowd breaks into laughter as they scatter. Children shriek with joy. The cart tips sideways. A sack of potatoes tumbles out, and is immediately claimed by 3 nearby pigs. The goat disappears into an alleyway. The goose, her wreath slightly askew, returns to the center of the square and lets out a single, authoritative honk. She is free. She is victorious. And she is completely unfazed by the idea that she was ever on trial to begin with. The judge sighs. Well, he says, brushing hay off his robes, I suppose we'll call that a success. The crowd agrees. The symbolic execution has turned into symbolic rebellion, and honestly, it feels right. You wander back toward the inlay. One man claims the goose bowed before stepping off the platform. A woman insists she heard the goose whisper justice as it chased the goat. The scribe, ever dutiful, scribbles down every version with equal sincerity. Inside the inn, the barmaid now offers a new drink, the honk of redemption, a potent mix of spiced wine and honey, served in a cup shaped vaguely like a goose's beak. You order one. As you sip, you overhear 2 old men discussing the next big festival. Should we make the goose a patron? Of what? Misrule? Bakery law? Of second chances. They nod, satisfied. Because something has changed. This goose, once just another barnyard nuisance, has become a strange sort of anchor, something to remember, something to laugh at, something to believe in. And somehow, that's exactly what the village needed. Evening falls. You step outside, watching as stars begin to prick holes in the sky. The air is cool, crisp, and still carrying a faint scent of hay and roasted chestnuts. Somewhere nearby, the goose settles into her new shelter behind the monastery, cooing softly as she tucks her head beneath her wing. All is quiet. And somewhere deep in the fields beyond, the goat is still running. The following morning arrives with the smell of damp leaves and simmering gossip. The town of Auten, though quiet in its morning rituals, baking bread, feeding chickens, sweeping doorsteps, is absolutely bursting at the seams with opinions. Not about taxes. Not about weather. Not even about that time the miller's cousin married a girl who talks to turnips. No. The talk of the town, of every stoop, barrel, and tavern table, is still the goose. She's everywhere now. Not physically, she's dozing peacefully in the monastery garden, belly full of clover, but mythologically. Her trial, her symbolic sentencing, her bishop-defying honk, it's all been swallowed and regurgitated into a dozen competing versions of what really happened. And you, still staying at the inn a little longer than you planned, now find yourself in the strange position of goose trial ethnographer. Everywhere you go, someone wants to tell you their version. It starts at the bakery. You stop in for a roll and find Thibault, flour-covered and wide-eyed, declaring to a crowd, she stared at the bishop, and I swear to St. Dunstan's chin, he dropped his notes on purpose. She bewitched him. I saw it. A customer scoffs. Bewitched? She just wanted his hat. Can't blame her. That hat was ridiculous. Ridiculous or sacred? Someone else mutters. Both, says a passing monk. Later, by the town well, Agath and Benoit hold court from their bench. She's a blessing in disguise, Agatha says, spreading jam on her biscuit with the gravity of a prophet. Benoit nods. A sign that the harvest next year will be strange but plentiful. You ask how they know? Agatha leans close. Because the dog's been quiet since the trial. Hasn't barked once. And the moon's been brighter, Benoit adds. You resist the urge to say it's been cloudy all week. By noon, the gossip has swelled to operatic proportions. You learn that some now believe the goose is a reincarnated saint. That she honked 3 times at exactly midnight, signaling the arrival of a new age. That the goat she chased is, in fact, the real villain, possibly cursed. Historians still argue whether such folklore developed organically or was cultivated by the church to create shared moral fables. But here, it's happening in real time. A story's being born. And no one can quite agree on what the story means, only that it matters. Back in the tavern, a traveling peddler offers goose-shaped trinkets carved from. That evening, you're invited to the home of Jacques, the village blacksmith, who, between hammering metal and fixing cart axles, has become something of an unofficial philosopher. He gestures for you to sit near the hearth and pours a mug of something warm and vaguely nutty. Then he says, "You know what the real miracle was?" You raise an eyebrow. No one argued about taxes for 2 weeks. He grins. You laugh. But when was the last time the whole town focused on one thing? We listened to each other. We gathered in the square without fighting. Even the bishop and the baker stood side by side, arguing about goose theology, not whose shed blocked whose view of the sunrise. He sips his drink. That's the power of stories, friend. They let us pretend the world is simpler than it is. And sometimes, when the story's just strange enough, it becomes true. You leave Jacques home a little dazed. Not from the drink, though it was potent, but from the quiet weight of his words. You wander through the square once more. Lanterns swing gently in the breeze, casting golden puddles on the cobblestones. In a corner, a pair of teenagers reenact the hat-snatching scene, one wearing a mop as a wig and the other flapping their arms furiously. You stop and watch. The audience, just a few neighbors, smiling and leaning on their elbows, laughs quietly. Someone passes around roasted chestnuts. Someone else taps a slow rhythm on an empty wine jug. It's simple. It's ridiculous. It's perfect. And it hits you. The goose didn't just stir up the past. She created future. A story to be retold. Embellished. Honked over. Later, back in your room at the inn, you sit by the window, candlelight flickering against the old stone walls, and try to count how many versions of the trial you heard today. One said the goose could speak Latin. One claimed she bowed at the altar. One insisted she whispered the name of a lost saint. None of them were true. But none of them were false, either, not in the way stories work. Truth here is elastic. Measured not in accuracy, but in effect. And this story? It's reshaped the village. Loosened their shoulders. Knit them tighter. And so, by candle's end, you write your own version. It's not scholarly. It's not complete. But it's honest. It begins, there once was a goose who taught a village to laugh, to argue, to gather, and to see itself. Not through mirrors or sermons, but through feathers and farce. And the world, ever chaotic, made sense for a little while. You seal the parchment, tuck it into your satchel, and blow out the flame. In the silence that follows, you think you hear the softest sound, a single honk far away. Maybe it's your imagination. Maybe it's just the wind. But either way you smile. Because tomorrow, someone else will add their version. And the goose will live on, not as a criminal, not as a saint, but as something far more durable. A very, very good story. You awake the next morning with goose folklore still echoing in your dreams, half-remembered lines about wings, wheat, and whispered Latin. The village seems quieter today, like it's exhaled after the spectacle. But as you stroll through the square, something new stirs in your mind. If this goose trial wasn't a one-off, and clearly it wasn't, then how many more animals have shuffled through the courts of medieval France? You ask around. The scribe, who's now developed a slight hand tremor from chronicling every goose-related event since last Tuesday, suggests you visit the old Abbey archive again. Ask for the vermin docket. Brother Matthew, the archivist on duty today, greets you with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for a quiet guest who brings snacks. After a bit of rummaging and muttered complaints about weevils, he lays before you a worn leather folio labeled in looping script, Process et Jubments de Animo, 1200 to 1499. You open it carefully. The first case is dated 1321, long before the Goose, long before most of the buildings in the village even existed. A sow in Claremont was tried for infanticide. Witnesses described the pig's demeanor as notably unrepentant. It was hanged in the town square, its body dressed in peasant clothing to underscore its humanoid crime. Another entry tells of a group of cows in Brie who, during a lunar eclipse, stampeded through a chapel garden, destroying holy herbs. The town court sentenced the entire herd to a week of penance, yes, actual penance, including fasting and daily blessings performed by reluctant monks. You raise an eyebrow at Matthew. He shrugs. Cows are stubborn, but apparently redeemable. You read on. A particularly strange case involves a rooster who was accused of laying an egg. As absurd as it sounds, such events were taken as omens of the demonic. In Basel, the rooster was not only tried, but burned at the stake, the act recorded with all the gravity of a state execution. The local bishop reportedly preached a sermon about unnatural birds and their threat to cosmic order. Historians still argue whether the people believed these animals possessed intent, or if the trials served more as symbolic purges. Either way, the punishments were real. The rituals, grim, theatrical, and meticulously recorded, suggest the line between legal justice and spiritual protection blurred almost completely. And it wasn't just barnyard beasts. The next entry you read documents a bizarre lawsuit in St. Julian in 1478, brought against a swarm of caterpillars. The creatures were devouring the vineyards. The townspeople petitioned the bishop's court to issue an excommunication. The verdict? The caterpillars were formally ordered to vacate within 7 days or face divine expulsion. Spoiler, they did not leave. Which leads to another common pattern in these records: collective disappointment. When the excommunications failed, the people often rationalized it. They hadn't prayed hard enough. The sin in the town outweighed the righteousness of the court. Or, most commonly, that next time, it'll work. And in some cases it did. Sort of. You read about a group of rats in Autun, yes, this very village, who were given legal notice to evacuate a granary in 1386. The town's lawyer argued the case against them, and a notice was read aloud at 3 separate intersections, as required. No rats showed up to defend themselves, obviously. But after the third reading, the grain store was mysteriously emptied of pests. Divine justice or coincidence? The jury, then and now, remains out. It all begins to blur in your mind. These cases, strange as they seem, begin to sketch an outline of something more profound, a culture trying to hold chaos accountable. To build meaning into a world full of things they couldn't control. Bad weather. Plagues. Infertile soil. Mischievous livestock. You sit back in your chair, rubbing your temples, and realize this wasn't madness. It was grief management. It was stress ritualized into procedure. And the animals? They were the perfect defendants. Silent, strange, and already halfway mythical. Brother Matthew slides another scroll toward you. This one's a personal favorite, he says. You unroll it. A 14th century court in Savigny-le-Vieux tried a pack of wolves for repeated attack, but they were wolves, you say. They were already killable. Matthew smiles. Yes. But now it was officially sanctioned by God and court. You chuckle. What happened next? He shrugs. A few shepherds swore the wolves moved on. Others said the sentence cursed the land for a generation. Either way, it's a good story. And that's what sticks with you as you walk back through the village, scrolls still echoing in your head. These weren't trials in the way we think of them today. They were ceremonies. Stories dressed as verdicts. And the villagers? They weren't fools. They knew the caterpillars wouldn't leave. That pigs can't feel remorse. That a goose doesn't understand sacred space. but performing the trial made the pain manageable, the chaos legible. You pause by the monastery wall, where the goose of autumn is waddling quietly through the garden, oblivious to her newfound fame. She's just a bird. But because of her, the village found connection. Story. A bit of joy and absurdity stitched into the grey fabric of medieval life. And now you understand, she isn't the first animal to stand trial in France. But she might be the most memorable. As the last of the autumn leaves drift lazily through the village air, you find yourself sitting at a worn bench outside the tavern, sipping something mulled and mildly suspicious, listening once again to tales of animals who've stood trial, not just in France, but beyond its vine-laced borders. "Did I ever tell you about the mice of Lausanne?" says Jacques the blacksmith, sauntering over with a tankard in one hand and a slab of cheese in the other. Whole trial. All proper. Mice were warned. Summoned by name, no less. You blink. They summoned the mice. By name? He shrugs. Well, not each mouse. That would take weeks. But they were addressed formally. All rodents residing in the monastery of St. Bernard or something like that. You're not even surprised anymore. The truth is, once you've seen a goose steal a bishop's hat mid-blessing and then be reprimanded with full monastic ceremony, the legal persecution of rodents feels almost normal. And the more stories you hear, the more bizarre and oddly touching they become. One merchant tells you about roosters tried in Switzerland, not just for demonic egg-laying, but for crowing at inappropriate hours, thereby disturbing sacred silence. Another describes a trial in Italy where a dog was executed for biting a noble's shadow. Yes, the shadow. That afternoon, curiosity carries you to the village schoolhouse, where the teacher, a pale man with spectacles and an impressive chalk habit, has compiled a small collection of noteworthy trials of beasts. He's even drawn little illustrations beside each entry, which you find oddly charming. Take this one, he says, pointing to a picture of a donkey wearing what looks like a bishop's stole. That's from a case in Rome. A donkey kicked over a communion chalice. The priest insisted it was possessed. Exorcism first, then a tribunal. And the verdict? You ask? Banishment. Sent to a farm 3 valleys away. Apparently it reformed and became quite fond of turnips. It's easy to laugh, of course. To shake your head and wonder what everyone was drinking back then. But then you start to see the pattern. Every trial, no matter how absurd, follows a rhythm. A problem. A scapegoat. A judgment. A ritual to bind it all together. And always, the creature at the center becomes something more than itself. Take the mice in monasteries. These weren't just pests. They became metaphors. Invaders. Agents of temptation. Living parables for spiritual decline. Their removal wasn't just a question of cleanliness. It was a symbolic act of purification. Or consider the case you find in a crumbling scroll later that day. A colony of weevils excommunicated in 1519 from a vineyard in St. Julien because they destroyed a prized crop of grapes. The court even appointed a defense attorney for the weevils, a young cleric, who argued that the insects were God's creatures and had as much right to the earth's bounty as man. Historians still argue whether the whole thing was satirical, a parody of legal excess, or if the court genuinely struggled with the morality of squashing the divine handiwork of creation. In the end, the court compromised. They designated a field just outside the village for the weevils to live in, and issued an official decree: "You may remain there in peace, and we shall not pursue you." The idea, of course, was that the weevils would read the scroll, pack their tiny bags, and move out. Naturally, they did not. But the vineyard was replanted anyway, the community felt cleansed, and a new prayer was added to the spring planting ritual: "Lord, protect us from small mouths with endless hunger." You close the scroll and shake your head. There's something heartbreakingly human about it all. The desire to reason with insects. The insistence on moral procedure. The need to formalize the chaos. Later, you talk to Brother Ammon again, the quiet theologian with a love of footnotes and sheep metaphors. He sits with you beneath a crooked apple tree near the monastery, his hands wrapped around a cup of nettle tea. We tried to reason with animals, he says slowly, because we were still learning how to reason with ourselves. He gestures toward the monastery garden, where the goose of autumn waddles peacefully between rows of winter greens. She doesn't know she was tried, he says. But she knows she was watched. Responded to. Elevated. And maybe that's all justice ever is, a performance we hope someone is paying attention to. You sit in silence, the cold wind threading its fingers through the dry leaves. In the fading light, the garden looks like something out of a dream, soft, earthy, enclosed by crumbling walls and rustling sage. The goose pauses, looks toward you, then continues her patrol. Perhaps she's checking for caterpillars. Or sins. Or both. By evening, you've compiled your own list, a quiet ledger in the back of your journal titled Creatures Who Face the Bench. You include the goose of autumn. Reprimanded. Honked defiantly. The sow of Claremont. Executed. Mourning ribbons worn by farmers. The vineyard weevils. Exiled to a fictional field. The rooster of Basel. Burned. Memorial plaque later defaced by pigeons. The caterpillars of St. Julian. Warned. Ignored. Still munching. And as you write, you realize that each case, however strange, was an expression of hope. Hope that the world had rules. Hope that guilt could be named. Hope that punishment might invite mercy, or at least make sense of pain. You put down your pen. You exhale. And in the deepening quiet, the story feels fuller now. Not just a tale about a goose on trial, but a long, winding tradition of humans looking into the face of the unknowable, and giving it a name. Then judging it. Then making peace with it. In the distance, the monastery bell tolls once. The goose doesn't react. She's busy inspecting a cabbage. As it should be. The sun rises late now, dragging itself over the hills like a sleepy child unwilling to start the day. The village is wrapped in frost this morning, roofs dusted white, breath hanging in the air like slow incense. But inside the chapel, the hearths crackle, and Brother Ammon is already waiting, motioning for you to join him at a table littered with half-finished scrolls and a pot of steaming chicory. You've come with questions today, specifically about the why. Why were these trials not only allowed but justified through church doctrine? What mental gymnastics and theological scaffolding were required to look a cow in the eye and declare, "You have sinned"? Brother Ammon, ever the patient theologian, steeples his fingers and smiles. To understand how animals could be judged, he says, you must first understand how the church viewed creation. He pours tea, as though this is a gentle fireside chat and not the beginning of a theological minefield. In medieval Christian thought, he continues, all creatures were created by God. All served a purpose, however obscure. But not all were considered equal in soul. That distinction belonged, officially, only to humans. Animals were said to be without reason, driven by instinct. You nod. So, they weren't thought to sin, per se? Ah, he says, tapping his chin. That's where it gets complicated. He explains that while animals were technically not moral agents in the same way as humans, they could still be instruments of evil, or, depending on the case, victims of it. Their behavior could be interpreted as evidence of larger spiritual forces at work. A pig trampling a child might not be guilty of murder, but it might be seen as an agent of disorder. A visible symptom of invisible decay. And herein lies the twist. Theological scholars of the time debated whether animals could be influenced by demons, Brother Ammon says, and some even believed certain beasts were more susceptible. Pigs, goats, and yes, birds, especially ones known to mimic speech. He gestures vaguely at a painting on the wall of a magpie perched beside a saint. The magpie appears to be whispering. Or hissing. Many church fathers saw these trials not simply as legal events, but as opportunities for spiritual purification. To rid a community of a tainted presence, and reaffirm divine order. Historians still argue whether this was sincere belief or a convenient way to channel collective anxiety. But in practice, the doctrines serve to theologize fear, to sanctify the strange, to make room in the religious imagination for all manner of cosmic disorder, preferably with a tidy verdict at the end. Brother Ammon retrieves a worn manuscript titled De Ordine Bestiarum, on the order of beasts. It's a tangled mix of bestiary, sermon notes, and ecclesiastical legal theory. He flips it open to a page featuring a goat with a halo. Some monks believed certain animals were part of the divine symphony, he says. Each species had its note to sing. When one sang out of tune, so to speak, it meant something was wrong, either with the beast or with us. You trace a finger over the goat's oddly human eyes. And the trials were a way to find the sour note. You ask? He nods. To correct it. Publicly. Symbolically. If necessary, dramatically. He explains how the ordo, or divine order, was a constant preoccupation for medieval clergy. Everything had a place: stars, kings, peasants, geese. When something strayed from its appointed role, when a creature trampled consecrated ground or interrupted a mass, order was threatened. The goose, he says, wasn't just a nuisance. She was, temporarily, a rupture. A sign. And signs demand interpretation. You lean back, exhaling slowly. It all makes a peculiar kind of sense now. If your worldview is built on the idea that the world is a carefully tuned machine crafted by divine hands, then every cluck, honk, or snort could be a message. Or a warning. And that message couldn't go unaddressed. Brother Ammon sips his tea. It was easier to put a beast on trial than to admit the drought was random. Or that people were frightened. Or that the rituals felt hollow. You think of the trial again, the solemnity, the Latin, the pageantry, and how it all felt like theater and sacrament rolled into one. And the goose, caught in the middle, became both stage prop and symbol. What about the defense? You ask? The appointed lawyers. The rituals of fairness. Ammon smiles. A necessary performance. Even beasts deserve process, because without it, the ritual isn't complete. The people needed to see mercy offered, even if it wouldn't be taken. You remember the goose's moment of protest, the snatching of the bishop's hat. Whether defiance or coincidence, it gave the whole trial a strange, delightful punctuation. The idea that even a creature outside the sacred order could disrupt it with perfect timing. And what about now? You ask? Surely the church no longer believes in any of this? Brother Ammon laughs quietly. Of course not. The theology has matured. But the need? The impulse? It's still here. We just channel it differently. He gestures toward a stack of prayer requests and complaint letters. People still want ritual. Still want justice for things beyond their control. Only now, they send angry notes when birds steal from their gardens instead of demanding a trial. Outside, bells toll softly. The goose honks in reply. Whether in protest, boredom, or affirmation, it's hard to say. You thank Brother Ammon and leave the chapel feeling heavy and light at once. Theologically informed. Morally amused. Philosophically rattled. You walk slowly past the monastery garden. The goose of autumn is there, pecking at some frostbitten parsley, utterly unaware of her elevated place in metaphysical debate. And yet, perhaps in her own way, she does know. She honks as you pass once, then struts to a patch of sunlight like a creature fully confident in her role as semi-divine muse. You chuckle. In a world full of uncertain signs, maybe a goose really is the perfect messenger, ambiguous, unpredictable, delightfully annoying. And maybe the message isn't as mysterious as it seems. Maybe it's just this: life is absurd. People are fragile. Order is a dream. But if we can name the chaos, try it, dress it in robes, sentence it to gardening duty, then maybe, just maybe, we can live with it. You're back at the tavern tonight, warm fire crackling, the smell of cloves and singed bread in the air, surrounded once again by the soft hum of village conversation. But this time, the subject isn't the goose herself, or her crimes, or even her dramatic courtroom antics. Tonight, the villagers are pondering the deeper mystery. Why did it happen at all? Why did anyone go along with putting a goose on trial in the first place? Why take it seriously? Why not just laugh and move on? Because life is boring, says the baker, half laughing as he dunks a crust of bread in wine. And ridiculous. And cold. And sometimes it just helps to have something to blame that isn't your cousin or the tax collector. But we could have laughed it off, someone else says from the shadows near the hearth. Sure, the baker replies. But would we still be talking about it weeks later if we had? That's the question, isn't it? You sip your drink slowly and listen as the conversation winds between mockery and meaning, between doubt and defense. The longer the villagers sit with it, the more complicated their feelings become. And they're not alone in their uncertainty. Because even among scholars, centuries later, with books and theories and far more comfortable chairs, the question remains open: why did medieval people try animals at all? And the answers are as varied as the trials themselves. Some historians argue it was a legal loophole, a way to hold animal owners accountable without directly punishing them. In this view, others insist it was all metaphor. A kind of street-level allegory, low-stakes theater for high-stress times. Animals, especially ones that lived alongside humans, became convenient mirrors for human fears, hunger, violence, disorder. By punishing the animal, the community purged its own anxiety. Still others propose that these trials were simply rituals of control. In a world governed by plagues, unpredictable weather, and constant political upheaval, people craved order. And if dragging a goose or a pig into a courtroom made that order feel real, then so be it. Then there's the more cynical view. That it was all about power. That the church and local lords used these trials to remind people who controlled the law, who mediated justice, even when justice involved feathers and beaks. You ask Shock the blacksmith what he thinks. He scratches his beard, leans back in his chair, and says, "We do what makes sense at the time. And then we explain it later with fancier words." You smirk. That might be the most accurate theory yet. Back at the inn, you pull out your notes, flipping through scribbled margins and snippets of overheard gossip. You find the line you jotted down days ago: "Maybe the goose was just convenient." And next to it, written later, "Maybe we needed her to be." You stare at those two sentences and feel the weight of the whole story behind them. The trial was real. The evidence was presented. The punishment was delivered. But the meaning? That's still up for grabs. You recall one particularly strange moment from earlier in the week. During a walk near the edge of the village, you came across a small circle of stones nestled in the grass. At its center was a feather and a crust of bread. No sign. No explanation. You mentioned it later to a young boy in the market, and he simply nodded and said, "It's for the goose, so she remembers." Remembers what? You asked. He'd shrugged. That we meant it. The goose, apparently, doesn't need to remember what the villagers meant. Only that they did. Meaning, after all, doesn't have to be clear to be powerful. You return your gaze to your journal and continue reading notes. There's an entire section filled with scribbled debates between villagers, some saying the goose was a divine messenger, others claiming it was cursed, and one woman insisting that geese are just like that, you know? And that might be the most truthful summary of the entire event. They're just like that. Unpredictable. Annoying. Loud. Mysterious. Capable of throwing an entire legal system into a tailspin just by existing. But in that unpredictability, they force us to ask questions we never would otherwise. What is guilt? What is justice? Who belongs inside the boundaries of human morality? And who gets left outside? You close your journal. Because it's not just about the goose anymore. It never was. It's about how communities tell stories to survive. How they construct rituals not only to enforce order, but to make peace with its absence. To laugh in the face of absurdity without denying its impact. You head back outside one last time before sleep. The moon is low and bloated, casting soft shadows over the silent square. Across the stones, the monastery garden is just visible. You catch a glimpse of her, the goose, tucked under a bush, wing folded over her face, perfectly at peace. And somehow, even in her oblivious slumber, she seems to carry the weight of the whole tale on her back. Not because she understands it, but because she caused it. Or rather, she allowed it to happen. Just by being there. Just by honking at the wrong moment, stepping on the wrong crop, or interrupting the wrong sermon. And the village? They turn that interruption into something sacred. Historians may still debate what it all meant. They may write papers and argue at conferences about the symbolic role of livestock in pre-modern legal systems. But the villagers of Auten? They know the truth in their bones. That life is chaos. And sometimes you just need to put a goose on trial to feel like you're in charge again. Even if only for a day. By now, the goose has settled into her strange new legacy, part bird, part symbol, part sleepy village legend. Her feathers still molt like any other goose's, she still hisses at novices who get too close, and she still seems unnervingly adept at finding the one unguarded basket of root vegetables in any given garden. Yet no one calls her a nuisance anymore. She is, quite plainly, the goose. Today, a carpenter leaves a small wooden plaque by the garden gate, Warden of the Orchard. A child follows with a daisy-chain crown, which the goose promptly ignores. The monk assigned to observe her rehabilitation logs, with remarkable solemnity, that she spent most of the morning pecking aggressively at a pile of leaves. Justice has been served, apparently. But outside of Auten, stories are beginning to travel. And you begin to hear whispers, traders, pilgrims, travelers passing through, who mention the goose trial like it's already become folklore. In the next village over, someone claims the goose performed miracles. A cobbler tells you he heard the goose can heal toothaches by staring directly into your mouth. A merchant passing through insists she predicted a thunderstorm by flapping wildly 3 days in advance. You hear a bard perform a ballad, off-key and clearly improvised, called the feathered Defendant, which includes the chorus. She honked at sin, she hissed at pride. She stood where others ran to hide. You're fairly certain none of this actually happened, but you don't correct anyone. Because here's the strange thing. You want to believe it, too. Not because you think the goose is magical, but because somehow this ordinary creature waddled into something extraordinary. And now, the story is bigger than her. Much bigger. Even the bishop, in a rare moment of self-aware humor, delivers a sermon titled On Divine Mischief, in which he refers to the sacred honk that calls us to attention. The congregation laughs, gently. Not at him, but with him. Something has shifted. Not just in how people see the goose, but in how they see each other. The farmers who never spoke now trade eggs and gossip. The children who used to run wild through the chapel are quieter now, at least while candles are lit. A painter appears one afternoon with an easel and begins sketching the goose in profile, muttering about capturing justice in its purest form. The village has changed, not radically, not dramatically, but enough that you can feel it in the pauses between conversations. In the way people linger a little longer at the square. In the shared smiles that require no words. Historians still debate how long such transformations last. Was it a fleeting moment? A brief uniting absurdity before the next famine or scandal took hold? Or did the goose trial plant something deeper, a shared memory that softened edges and tethered hearts for years to come? You suspect it depends on who's telling the story? Because by now, there are different versions. You hear one in the tavern where the goose defends herself in flawless Latin. Another in the chapel yard where a little girl insists the goose glows faintly at night. Someone swears a dream revealed the goose is the reincarnation of a former abbot. The eyebrows are identical, he insists. You just have to squint. You nod. Politely. Because at this point, truth is not the point. Feeling is. And no one feels nothing about the goose. One evening, a group of pilgrims arrives halfway to Vézelay, having heard about the bird of benediction. They ask to see her. The monks oblige. The goose waddles out, blinks, and immediately bites the hem of a woman's robe. She declares it a blessing. And now, apparently, that's a thing too. You follow the pilgrims to the chapel where, after lighting candles, one of them leaves behind a small, hand-painted tile depicting the goose with a halo, standing atop a broken set of scales. It reads, Et facta estate pax per plumum, and peace was made through a feather. It's objectively absurd. And yet, deeply lovely. You take a walk the next morning to clear your head. Autumn is shifting toward early winter now. The trees are barer, their boughs exposed like knuckled hands. A soft frost paints the rooftops, and the fields hum with stillness. You climb a small hill overlooking the village, the chapel bell tolling gently in the distance, and think about everything that's happened. A goose interrupted a ritual. That disruption rippled outward, into suspicion, then spectacle, then story. It could have gone badly. It almost did. But instead of doubling down on fear or punishment, the village chose absurdity. They chose ritual, yes, but laced with play. With tenderness. With shared laughter. And in doing so, they made something sacred. Not the trial itself. Not even the goose. But the act of coming together. Of paying attention. Of naming the strange, and treating it with ceremony rather than scorn. You find yourself smiling. Because maybe, just maybe, this is the real miracle, not that the goose survived, not that she became a saint or a song, but that the people, just for a moment, became more than they were. Wiser. Kinder. More connected. You head back toward the village as the sun sets behind soft lavender clouds. As you pass the garden, the goose glances up, fluffs her feathers, and lets out a quiet, deliberate honk. It's neither reverent nor defiant. Just there. A sound to mark the moment. You nod in return. No need for speeches. The story, it seems, is telling itself now. It's a market day again, and the village square buzzes with a low, cheerful hum, livestock bleating, children chasing each other with sticks, merchants calling out the virtues of their slightly shriveled apples or deeply dented cookware. But you notice something new woven into the usual bustle. Goose-themed everything. There's a stall selling gingerbread geese, each decorated with a little icing judge's wig. A blacksmith has hung a sign over his forge, by the honk of justice, we straighten iron and wrongs. A weaver proudly displays a tapestry where the goose of autumn stands triumphant, flanked by the sun and moon, wearing a saint's halo and standing on a closed legal scroll. You weren't imagining it. The goose has officially become a symbol. Not just for this village, but potentially, for anyone looking to find meaning in madness. You drift through the crowd as the villagers prepare for what's now being called Feather Day. It's a new holiday, apparently. Unofficial. Improvised. But fully embraced. There's a parade this time, small, messy, delightful. Children in feathered cloaks march behind a cart carrying a life-sized goose effigy made of straw. The effigy wears a crown of wheat and a little wooden gavel dangles from a twine necklace. Behind them, a trio of musicians struggles to stay in tune while playing a song called the Defendant's Waltz, which someone composed just yesterday. You watch as the procession winds through the village, stopping at the old gallows platform, now repurposed as the stage of second chances. There, the village judge gives a short speech, which includes the phrases feather jurisprudence, honor among honkers, and a heartfelt thank you to the goat who. You drift to the edge of the crowd, where Brother Ammon stands with arms folded, a wry smile tugging at his usually solemn mouth. They've turned her into a seasonal icon, you say, amused. He nods. It was inevitable. The goose filled a gap. Not a religious one, necessarily, but a symbolic one. You watch as someone hands out small paper feathers, each inscribed with words like forgiveness, balance, and honk. The best rituals, he adds, are the ones we invent when we least expect to need them. You can see it now, how a creature that once seemed chaotic and intrusive has become a living parable, not of guilt, but of transformation. Not of crime, but of community. You ask, do you think they'll remember the real story in 10, 20 years? Brother Ammon chuckles. Absolutely not. But they'll remember a story. And that might be enough. The parade dissolves into dancing. Bread is shared. A new song is attempted, and mercifully cut short. And still, beneath it all, the goose wanders the monastery garden, now completely unfazed by her status. She nibbles on a forgotten turnip, flaps lazily at a novice who gets too close. People visit her now as though she were a shrine. They toss breadcrumbs near her feet and whisper things like, "Thank you," or "You helped us," or, inexplicably, "Please help my husband's gout." You're not sure how she feels about this. Probably indifferent. But you're also not sure it matters. The village needs her to mean something. And so she does. Historians will someday try to sort this all out. They'll find fragments, an odd court transcript, an embroidery depicting a goose flanked by clerics, perhaps a ballad scrawled on the back of a wine ledger. They'll argue over whether it was satire or sincerity, whether the people believed or merely played along, whether the goose stood for justice or simply offered a way to forget about everything else for a few blessed hours. But here, in the now, the answer is clear. It was both. Play and prayer. Farce and fable. A creature and a cause. And you begin to wonder what other stories hide beneath history's more serious surface. How many pigs, dogs, beetles, and goats once stood on trial, quietly shaping the human spirit with their dumb little faces and their perfect timing. How many absurdities help people survive. That evening, after the festivities quiet down, you join the village elders for a small, candlelit supper. Someone pours mulled cider into mismatched cups. A few leftover gingerbread geese are passed around. The atmosphere is warm, unrushed, comfortably drowsy. Someone asks, "Should we put her on the village seal?" There's laughter, but it fades into genuine consideration. Maybe, someone else says. Not as a joke. As a reminder. A reminder of what? That even nonsense deserves a proper hearing. You look around the table. No one is mocking. No one is scoffing. These are grown men and women, farmers, priests, blacksmiths, clerics, speaking earnestly about whether a goose should represent their town. And not for vanity. Not for tourism. But because she meant something. She was the interruption that made everyone stop. The inconvenience that made the village look at itself. And instead of tightening their grip on order, they opened their arms to absurdity. Instead of demanding fear, they shared laughter. Instead of punishing meaninglessness, they gave it meaning. The goose didn't change the world. But she did shift one little piece of it. And that's more than most of us can claim. By the time you return to your room at the inn, the sky is painted with stars and the night air carries the faint scent of hay, wood smoke, and roasted chestnuts. You sit by the window for a long time, letting the day's silliness settle into something deeper. You take out your journal, now stuffed with pages of ink and crumbs and tiny feathers tucked between its covers, and write. Today, they honored the goose not because she was guilty, but because she gave them something to care about. Something to gather around. Something to laugh at together. And in doing so, she absolved more than herself. You pause. Then add, "I think I understand now. Justice isn't always about guilt. Sometimes it's about grace." Outside, a faint honk echoes through the dark. You don't look. You don't need to. You already know she's there. And for now, that's enough. The next morning comes gently, like parchment soaking in warm tea. The air is quiet, chilled but kind, and the village moves slowly, recovering from celebration, from storytelling, from all the weight of the past few weeks turned featherlight through laughter. Your bags are packed. Not because you've grown tired of autumn, how could you? But because all good stories eventually ask you to step back, to carry them with you, rather than remain inside them forever. Still you linger. One last walk through the square. One final nod to the baker, who is now selling justice buns, slightly overbaked, with a satisfying crunch. One more glance at the old gallows stage, now repurposed with flowers and a wooden plaque that reads, "Let no creature go unheard." You smile at that. Not bad for a village that once debated whether a goose could harbor intent. Your feet take you, as they always do now, toward the monastery garden. And there she is. The Goose of Autumn. Guardian of the cabbage patch. Accidental saint. Legal precedent in feathers. She's sitting atop a small bale of straw, head tilted, eyes half closed. She doesn't move as you approach. You sit near her, not too close, and for a while, you both simply watch the world in silence. The garden is soft with morning dew. A few monks move quietly through the rows, their sandals brushing against sage and thyme. A finch sings somewhere nearby. The world feels still, balanced. It occurs to you that in all your time here, through all the tales, the documents, the jokes, and the theology, no one ever really asked, what did the goose want? Not justice. Not fame. Certainly not a courtroom. Just food. Space. Maybe a little sun. And yet, because she flapped into a ceremony, she became the hinge between order and chaos. The focal point for a community unsure of itself. A question mark made flesh and feathers. And somehow, this village had the good sense to embrace that. They didn't force clarity. They didn't demand she be more than she was. They just gave her the stage, then let her walk off it on her own terms. You chuckle to yourself. That's rare, in any era. Historians still argue whether these animal trials were spectacles of cruelty, absurd pageantry, or profound communal rituals. The truth, you now know, is layered. Sometimes all three. Sometimes none. Sometimes just a goose making a mess of things and people trying to make meaning from it. And what a meaning they made. You think back to the whispered prayers, the satirical, a wind stirs. The goose fluffs her feathers, then ambles away, one awkward step at a time, toward a patch of weeds she has absolutely no intention of sharing with the other birds. As you watch her go, you feel no urge to follow. The story has walked far enough. She doesn't need you to write the next chapter. She never did. You rise, brushing straw from your coat, and walk the long road out of town. The village recedes behind you, its rooftops curling smoke into the cold sky, its laughter trailing on the breeze, its absurd little legend carried forward in flower, feather, and memory. You carry your journal tight against your chest. Not because it holds answers, but because it holds witness. And in the end, perhaps that's all the goose ever asked of anyone. To be seen. To be heard. To be, if not understood, then at least remembered. So now, as your breath slows and your eyes grow heavy, let's leave the village behind, quiet now, resting after a tale well told. The torches have been doused, the goose has found her perch beneath the stars, and the monks sing soft prayers that melt into the mossy stones. Let the wind trace gentle lines across your thoughts, like a scribe's pen over parchment. Let the echoes of honking geese and sleepy laughter fade into memory, like distant bells you no longer need to follow. The trial is over. The verdict is peace. You're safe now, in a world where even the absurd has its place, where the silly and the sacred walk feather to feather, where community grows in the cracks between certainty and surprise. Nothing needs solving now. No sense needs making. Just a story, worn smooth by retelling, settling beside you like a warm wool cloak. The road is behind you. The candle's nearly out. The garden is still. The fields wait for frost. And the goose of autumn, symbol, saint, and strange little scribe of a simpler truth, rests quietly under the watchful eye of the moon. Sleep comes softly here. You may drift now. No more verdicts to deliver. No more scrolls to read. Only the slow rhythm of your breath, the cradle of night, and the memory of feathers on a breeze.